Prologue, the call. The house was too quiet. That's what Ed Friedland would remember later, the absence of sound. No music from Kim's stereo. No baby babbling from the nursery. Just silence, thick and wrong, the moment he opened the front door. He'd left his reading glasses on the nightstand. It was the kind of oversight that punctuated a surgeon's morning, lunch still hours away, but already he was halfway through rounds when he realized the patient charts might as well have been hieroglyphics without them. The drive home took 12 minutes from Presbyterian Hospital. 12 minutes of July heat already climbing toward 90, the kind of Charlotte morning that made the air feel solid. Churchill Road was quiet the way suburban streets always were on a Friday mid-morning. Mrs. Henderson next door watering her azaleas. Someone's sprinkler ticking across a lawn 3 houses down. The Cherokee roses Kim had planted last spring climbing the mailbox post, white petals already browning at the edges. The front door swung open before his key even turned. Unlocked. Ed stopped, hand on the knob. Kim was meticulous about locks, compulsive almost. Deadbolt, chain, even during the day when she was home. It was one of the small battles they'd given up fighting, his easy California childhood versus her practical urban wariness. She'd grown up in neighborhoods where you locked your doors. Kim? Nothing. He stepped inside. The cool rush of air conditioning, the grandfather clock in the hallway marking 10:47. Still nothing. Kim? The nursery door was open at the end of the hall. He could see the edge of the crib, the mobile he'd hung last week still turning lazy circles. No movement, no sound. His heart kicked once, hard. Then the crying started. Not the fussy, irritable cry of a baby who'd missed a nap. This was raw, desperate. The sound ripped through the silence like something primal and terrified, and Ed's legs were moving before his brain caught up. He took the hallway in 4 strides. The nursery door banged against the wall. Their daughter stood in the crib, hands clutching the rail, face red and tear-streaked. When she saw him, she screamed louder, reaching with grasping fingers. "Hey, hey!" He scooped her up, her small body rigid with distress. She buried her face in his shoulder and wailed, and that's when the smell hit him. Not just the sour milk tang of spit-up or the sweet rot of a diaper that needed changing. Something else, metallic and thick, blood. The baby's nursery opened onto the master bedroom. The door stood ajar. Ed's hand was shaking as he pushed it wider. Kim lay on the floor beside the bed. For one impossible moment, his brain refused to process what he was seeing. His wife, her back to him. Arms twisted at a wrong angle, hands pulled together. Silver glint of handcuffs catching the light from the window. Blood. So much blood it had soaked into the rug, dark and spreading, the cream fibers turned rust brown. A pool of it beneath her throat. Kim. He was across the room without remembering moving, the baby still screaming in his arms. He dropped to his knees beside her. Her eyes were open, fixed on nothing, her throat. He turned away, stomach heaving, pressed his palm over his mouth. The baby's cries filled the room, filled his skull, and he couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't make sense of the world tilting sideways. Phone. He needed a phone. He stumbled back into the nursery, fingers numb as he fumbled for the receiver on the dresser, punched 911 with a shaking hand. The baby thrashed against him, tiny fists beating his chest. 911, what's your emergency? My wife, his voice cracked. I think she's dead. Someone killed her. Sir, what's your location? He gave the address, Churchill Road, Cotswold, Southeast Charlotte. The words came automatic, clinical, the way he'd been trained to speak during codes at the hospital. Detached, professional, even as his world collapsed into the raw animal sound coming from his daughter's mouth. Is the attacker still in the house, sir? Ed's eyes snapped to the bedroom door, the hallway beyond, the front door he'd walked through minutes ago, standing open to the summer heat. I don't know. I don't think so. Can you check if she's breathing? She's not. Her throat. He stopped. Couldn't say it. She's gone. Units are on the way, sir. Stay on the line with me. He sank onto the nursery floor, back against the wall, baby clutched to his chest. Through the open door he could see Kim's body, the unnatural stillness, the blood spreading into patterns on the rug he'd helped her pick out at that antique store in Davidson. She'd loved that rug. Pale cream with delicate blue flowers. The flowers were gone now, drowned in red. Sirens rose in the distance. Someone's dog started barking. Mrs. Henderson's voice floated through the open front door. Ed, is everything okay? And he wanted to laugh, wanted to scream, because nothing would ever be okay again. The baby had stopped crying. She lay against him now, hiccuping small, gasping breaths, exhausted. Her tiny hand clutched his shirt collar. She smelled like powder and milk and innocence, and she had no idea. Didn't know her mother was gone. Didn't know the world had just tilted off its axis. Tires screeched outside, voices shouting, heavy footsteps pounding up the walkway. Sir, are you still there? I'm here, Ed whispered, but he wasn't. Not really. Some essential part of him had stopped the moment he pushed open that bedroom door. Stopped, and would stay frozen in that terrible silence for years to come. The first officer burst through the front door, hand on his weapon. Charlotte Mecklenburg Police? In here, Ed called, voice hollow. The nursery. They found him like that, orthopedic surgeon, new father, widower, sitting on the floor with his daughter in his arms, staring at nothing, staring at everything. The questions would start soon, the investigation, the suspicion. He didn't know it yet, couldn't imagine it. But in 4 years they would charge him with her murder. In 7 years, a civil jury would name the real killer. And in 35 years, DNA science would finally prove what everyone should have known from the beginning. But in that moment, in the nursery with the mobile still turning overhead and his daughter's tears soaking through his shirt, Ed Friedland knew only one thing with absolute certainty. The monster who did this had walked out their front door and into the July heat, had left it unlocked, had left a baby screaming in her crib and a mother bleeding on a cream rug with blue flowers. And he was still out there. It would be 35 years before anyone knew who had killed her. And when the truth came, it would reveal a monster who lived 5 minutes away and had been named as a suspect from the very beginning. Kim Thomas Friedland's alarm didn't go off on July 27, 1990. It didn't need to. Her 10-month-old daughter had developed an internal clock more reliable than any digital display, up at 5:47 a.m., give or take 3 minutes. Kim heard the first rustling from the nursery down the hall and smiled into her pillow before opening her eyes. Friday morning. Ed had an early surgery. She'd have the whole day alone with the baby. Some women would have dreaded that. Kim cherished it. She patted down the carpeted hallway of their Cotswold home, the morning light just beginning to filter through the Carolina pines outside. Their daughter stood in her crib, gripping the rail with chubby fists, face splitting into a gummy grin, the moment she saw her mother. Kim's heart did what it always did in these moments, melted completely. "Good morning, sunshine," she whispered, lifting the warm weight of her daughter against her chest. The baby smelled like sleep and baby powder and something indefinably sweet that Kim had tried and failed to capture in words when writing in her journal. "Ready to take on the patriarchy today?" The baby gurgled. Close enough to yes. The woman before the victim. At 32 years old, Kim Thomas Friedland was exactly where she wanted to be in life, which was rare enough to feel like a small miracle. She'd married her college sweetheart, Ed, solid and steady, a brilliant orthopedic surgeon with hands that could rebuild shattered bones and gentle enough to rock a colicky baby at 3 a.m. without complaint. They'd bought this house in Cotswold 2 years ago, a neighborhood of tree-lined streets and brick ranchers where people still waved to each other and kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. And she had her work. God, she had her work. Women's rights activist was how the newspapers would describe her later, in that reductive way that obituaries flatten lives into resume bullets. But Kim's activism wasn't some abstract political stance or weekend hobby. It was the architecture of her daily life, the lens through which she saw everything. She organized, she agitated, she showed up. Tuesday nights, she ran a support group for women leaving abusive relationships, held in the basement of a Methodist church on Central Avenue. Thursdays, she volunteered at Planned Parenthood, where she'd counsel terrified teenagers and hold their hands and never, ever judge. Weekends, she knocked on doors for local candidates who actually gave a damn about childcare and equal pay and domestic violence funding. And in between all of it, she wrote letters to the editor, op-eds for the Charlotte Observer, furious, passionate screeds that her friends said made them want to march through the streets with signs. Ed teased her about her manifesto phase, but he said it with pride. He framed one of her published pieces and hung it in his office at the hospital. My wife, he'd tell colleagues, is going to change the world. Kim didn't need to change the whole world. She'd settle for changing Charlotte. Friday morning, July 27th, 1990. The morning routine unfolded like choreography they'd perfected over 10 months of sleepless trial and error. Kim changed the baby's diaper while Ed showered. Ed made coffee while Kim nursed. They traded off bites of toast over the breakfast table while their daughter demolished a bowl of mashed banana with more enthusiasm than accuracy. Ed glanced at the clock, 6:47 a.m., and swore softly. "Early case?" Kim asked. "ACL reconstruction, 22-year-old college athlete." Ed gulped the last of his coffee and kissed the top of his daughter's head, then Kim's lips. "I'll be home for lunch if it goes fast. You good?" "We're great." Kim wiped banana from the baby's eyebrow. "We're going to overthrow capitalism and demand universal childcare. Maybe hit the park if it's not too hot." Ed grinned. "Try not to get arrested. No promises." He grabbed his keys from the hook by the door, his medical bag from the hall closet, paused, came back and kissed Kim again, longer this time, his hand cupping her cheek. "Love you," he said. "Love you more." Impossible. It was their thing, stupid and sweet and theirs. The door closed. Kim heard his car start in the driveway, the rumble of the engine fading as he backed out and headed toward the hospital. She looked at her daughter, banana-smeared and beaming, and felt that wash of contentment that still surprised her sometimes. She'd fought so hard for women to have choices, to not be defined solely by motherhood, to have careers and autonomy and voices. And she'd chosen this sticky-handed, exhausting, transcendent chaos. She'd chosen it while also choosing her activism, her writing, her organizing. She'd chosen both. That was the whole goddamn point. "Okay, kiddo," she said, lifting her daughter from the high chair. "Bath time. Then Mama's got some calls to make about the city council hearing next week. You can chew on your blocks and look adorable. Team effort." The baby grabbed a fistful of Kim's hair and yanked. Kim laughed. The neighborhood Cotswold in 1990 was the kind of neighborhood where people didn't lock their doors during the day, where women pushed strollers in packs down the sidewalks, chatting about whose kids had which summer cold, where the biggest crime was usually someone letting their dog poop on a neighbor's lawn without cleaning it up. Kim felt safe here. That was part of why they'd bought the house. She had grown up in a tougher part of Charlotte, where her mother worked 2 jobs, and her father was mostly absent, and she learned early that the world was not designed for women like her mom, women who scraped and sacrificed and still couldn't get ahead. That was where Kim's fire had come from. The bone-deep knowledge that the system was rigged and someone needed to fight to unrig it. But she wanted something different for her daughter. She wanted her to grow up in a place where she could ride her bike to a friend's house and play in sprinklers and not have to learn too young that the world was divided into people with power and people without it. Kim would teach her daughter to fight, but first she wanted her to feel safe. Churchill Road was quiet that Friday morning. Most of the neighbors were already at work or running errands. Kim moved through her morning, cleaning up breakfast, starting a load of laundry, settling the baby on a blanket in the living room with her toys. She had a phone call scheduled for 9:30 a.m. with a woman from the League of Women Voters about coordinating a voter registration drive. She had notes to review, talking points to prep. She made another cup of coffee, picked up a ringing toy her daughter had flung across the room, checked the clock, 8:43 a.m. Everything normal, everything fine, everything about to shatter. The activist's legacy later, much, much later. People would ask what Kim had been working on in those final weeks of her life. Like maybe her activism had gotten her killed. Like maybe she'd pissed off the wrong man with her letters about domestic violence funding or her columns about reproductive rights. The truth was simpler and more terrible. Kim Thomas Friedland wasn't killed because she was an activist. She was killed because she was a woman, alone in her home, and a predator decided she was prey. That predator had a name, Marion Anthony Gales. He was 28 years old. He lived in Greer Heights, a 5.5-minute walk from Churchill Road. He had a criminal record that started when he was 16, when he shot and wounded a woman on Churchill Road, the very same street where Kim would die 16 years later. He had a pattern: violence against women, again and again and again. And on July 27, 1990, that pattern would intersect with Kim Thomas Friedland's life in the worst possible way. But she didn't know that yet. At 8:43 a.m., Kim was just a mother, playing with her baby, an activist who believed in a better world, a wife who loved her husband, a woman with plans for the afternoon and the weekend and the rest of her life. At 8:43 a.m., she was still just Kim. What we lost if Kim Thomas Friedland had lived, what would she have done? Her friends think about this sometimes. She'd have raised her daughter, obviously, taught her to be fierce and kind and unafraid. She'd have kept organizing, kept writing, kept showing up at city council meetings and candidate forums and grassroots fundraisers. She'd have been there in the 90s when the Violence Against Women Act passed, probably would have organized a celebration, invited everyone she knew, given a speech about how it was a start but not enough, never enough until women could walk through the world without fear. She'd have been there for her daughter's first day of kindergarten, her high school graduation, her wedding maybe. She'd have been a grandmother, possibly. She'd have aged into one of those women who terrify politicians and inspire college students and never ever shut up about injustice. She would have kept going. That's what Kim did. She kept going. Instead, she got 10 months of motherhood, 32 years of life. One Friday morning in July that started like every other and ended like none ever should. The final hours. We don't know exactly when Marion Gales entered the house on Churchill Road. We don't know if he knocked on the door and Kim answered, trusting and unsuspecting. We don't know if he forced his way in or talked his way in or simply walked through an unlocked door, because this was Cotswold in 1990 and people didn't lock their doors during the day. We don't know if Kim fought. God, we hope she fought. We know she was handcuffed behind her back. We know her throat was slashed. We know she died on the floor of her own home while her baby girl slept or played somewhere nearby, unaware that the world was ending. We know Marion Gale's DNA was on the rug beside her body, a fact that wouldn't be confirmed until February 2026, 35 years and 7 months after he killed her. We know he walked out of that house and back to his own place, 5.5 minutes on foot, and cleaned himself up and went about his day. We know that at 10:30 a.m., Dr. Ed Friedland would come home and find her. By then, Kim Thomas had been dead for hours, and the man who killed her had already disappeared into the neighborhood, back to his house, 5 minutes away on foot. At 10:30 a.m., Ed Friedland would come home and find her. By then, Kim Thomas had been dead for hours, and the man who killed her had already disappeared into the neighborhood, back to his house, 5 minutes away on foot. Book number 4, The Investigation Plus the Wrong Man. Kim Thomas, Murder, Charlotte, NC, 1990-2026. July 27, 1990. Morning, the 911 call came in at 10:47 a.m. A man's voice, shaking. "My wife, I think she's dead. Please, oh God, please send someone." The dispatcher tried to keep him on the line, but the sound that came through wasn't words anymore. Just the raw animal sound of someone whose world had just ended. Charlotte Mecklenburg police arrived at the Churchill Road home 7 minutes later. The neighborhood was quiet, middle-class Cotswold, the kind of place where people mowed their lawns on Saturday and waved to neighbors. Not the kind of place where women got murdered on a Friday morning. The officers found Dr. Ed Friedland in the driveway, unable to go back inside. His hands were shaking. He kept saying the same thing. "The baby. Is the baby okay?" Inside, they found Kim Thomas Friedland on the floor of the bedroom, 32 years old, hands cuffed behind her back, throat slashed. The cream rug beneath her body was soaked dark. The blood loss was massive. The brutality was immediate and obvious. This wasn't an accident, wasn't a burglary gone wrong. Someone had come into this house with a specific purpose: to kill Kim Thomas. In the next room, their 10-month-old daughter was crying in her crib, unharmed. She'd been there the whole time, a few feet away, while her mother died. The scene. The detective who caught the case was a 20-year veteran named Bill Thompson. He'd seen plenty of murders, but home invasions in broad daylight in Cotswold were rare. This wasn't gang violence or a drug deal gone bad. This was someone's home, someone's Friday morning. The first thing he noticed, no forced entry. The doors were locked. The windows were intact. Whoever killed Kim Thomas had either been let inside or had a key. That fact alone changed everything. It meant Kim knew her killer, or at least trusted them enough to open the door. The second thing, nothing was taken. Kim's purse was on the kitchen counter, wallet inside, credit cards untouched. Her jewelry was on the dresser, the TV, the electronics, all there. Whoever did this didn't come for money. The handcuffs were the detail that bothered Thompson the most. They weren't police issue. He could tell that immediately. Civilian cuffs, the kind you could buy at any adult store or online. Someone had brought them specifically for this. This was planned. The murder weapon, a knife, likely was gone. The killer had taken it with them, which suggested enough presence of mind to avoid leaving evidence. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was controlled violence. And then there was the DNA. The crime scene techs collected everything they could: blood samples, fibers from the rug beside Kim's body, trace evidence from the handcuffs, swabs from doorknobs and surfaces. In 1990, DNA testing was still relatively new, still expensive, still limited. They collected it because protocol demanded it, but no one was holding their breath for results. The technology just wasn't there yet. The husband. In any domestic murder, the spouse is the first suspect. Statistics don't lie. Women killed at home are most often killed by their husbands or boyfriends. So Ed Friedland, despite his obvious grief, despite the 911 call, became suspect number one. Thompson interviewed him that same day. Ed was an orthopedic surgeon, well-respected, no criminal record. He'd left for work that morning around 7:30 a.m. Kim was alive, making breakfast, playing with the baby. Everything was normal. He'd returned around 10:30 a.m. He'd forgotten some patient files and found her. His alibi checked out. The hospital confirmed he'd been in surgery from 8 to 10 a.m. Co-workers had seen him. The timeline didn't work. Ed volunteered for a polygraph. He passed. When the DNA results came back weeks later, Ed's DNA was exactly where you'd expect it to be, on his wife's body, on the sheets, on her clothes. But the DNA on the rug beside her body, the DNA that suggested a struggle, that suggested the killer had been close, it wasn't his. Still, Thompson couldn't shake the husband. No forced entry meant Kim had let someone in. Who would she let in at 8 a.m. on a Friday? A friend? A neighbor? Someone she knew? Or her husband, who already had a key? August 24th, 1990. A month after the murder, a patrol officer filed a routine report. It mentioned a name, Marion Gales. The context was thin, a tip, maybe, or a neighborhood sighting. The report didn't say much, just that Gales' name had come up in connection with the Churchill Road area. It was one of dozens of leads pouring in after Kim's death. Neighbors reporting suspicious cars, strange men, anyone who looked out of place. The report was filed. And then, like so many leads in the early chaos of an investigation, it disappeared into the stack. No one followed up. No one ran a background check on Marion Gales. No one discovered that he lived in Greer Heights, a 5.5-minute walk from Churchill Road. No one found out that 16 years earlier, at age 16, Gales had shot and wounded a woman on the exact same street where Kim Thomas now lay dead. The report sat in a file cabinet, and Marion Gales walked free. The stall. By the end of 1990, the investigation had hit a wall. The DNA evidence was collected, but the technology to analyze it fully didn't exist yet. The samples were degraded, mixed, insufficient for the crude testing methods available at the time. The lab could tell them there was an unknown male contributor on the rug beside Kim's body, but they couldn't tell them who. Ed Friedland remained the primary suspect, but the evidence wasn't there. His alibi held. The polygraph held. The DNA didn't match. Without a confession or a murder weapon, the DA wouldn't touch it. The case went cold. Kim's family held vigils. They kept her memory alive, kept pressure on CMPD, demanded answers. Her daughter, too young to remember her mother, grew up in the shadow of a murder no one could solve. Ed tried to rebuild his life, but the cloud never lifted. People whispered. In Cotswold, in the hospital halls, in the grocery store, he must have done it. How else do you explain it? And somewhere in Charlotte, Marion Gales went about his life. In and out of jail for petty crimes, assaults, drug charges, the usual rotation for a career criminal. He knew what had happened on Churchill Road. He'd been there. He'd felt the knife in his hand, heard Kim Thomas's last breath, walked out of that house and disappeared into the July heat. And no one came for him, not yet. 1994, the arrest. 4 years after Kim Thomas died, Charlotte Mecklenburg police made an arrest. Dr. Ed Friedland was charged with first-degree murder. The evidence was circumstantial at best. He'd found the body. He had a key to the house. There was no forced entry. The DNA testing was inconclusive, or more accurately, the technology wasn't advanced enough to definitively rule in or out. To investigators under pressure to solve a high-profile murder, Ed was the only suspect who made sense. The arrest sent shockwaves through Charlotte. Kim's friends and family were divided. Some believed the police had finally gotten their man. Others knew Ed, knew the way he'd loved Kim, the way he was raising their daughter alone, the devastation that still haunted him 4 years later, and couldn't believe he'd done it. Ed's nightmare had begun. The case against him. The prosecution's theory was simple: domestic violence. A marriage that looked perfect from the outside but was fractured within. A fight that escalated. A moment of rage. A husband who knew how to cover his tracks. But the evidence didn't support it. There was no history of abuse. Friends, family, co-workers, everyone who knew Kim and Ed described them as loving, stable, happy. Kim had been a vocal women's rights activist. If Ed had been abusive, someone would have known. Kim herself would have said something. The polygraph? Inadmissible in court, but Ed had passed it. Polygraphs aren't perfect, but they're hard to beat when you're lying about murdering your wife. The timeline? Ed had been in surgery when Kim died. Yes, the medical examiner's estimate of time of death had a 2-hour window, but it was tight. Ed would have had to leave the hospital, drive home, murder his wife, clean up, and return, all without anyone noticing. The DNA? That was the prosecution's biggest problem. The DNA on the rug beside Kim's body didn't match Ed. The testing technology in 1994 was better than it had been in 1990, and while it still couldn't identify the unknown male contributor, it could rule people out, and it ruled out Ed Friedland. Still, the DA pushed forward. The case had gone unsolved for 4 years. The community wanted answers. Ed was the only suspect they had. The nightmare for Ed, the arrest was surreal. One moment, he was a widower trying to raise his daughter and keep Kim's memory alive. The next, he was sitting in a jail cell, charged with killing the woman he'd loved. The media coverage was brutal. Local news ran stories with Ed's mugshot next to Kim's smiling photo. Husband charged in activist's murder. The implication was clear. He'd done it. The police had said so. In Cotswold, neighbors stopped making eye contact. At the hospital, colleagues whispered. Parents at his daughter's daycare looked at him differently. He was no longer Ed, the grieving widower. He was Ed, the suspected killer. His daughter was too young to understand, but old enough to feel the shift. She asked why people were staring, why the reporters were outside their house, why Daddy had to go to court. Ed's lawyer, a public defender who knew a weak case when he saw one, pushed for dismissal. The evidence was circumstantial. The DNA didn't match. The timeline didn't work. The motive didn't exist. But the wheels of justice moved slowly. For months, Ed lived in limbo, free on bond, but tethered to a murder charge that could put him in prison for life. He couldn't work. He couldn't leave the state. He could barely function. At night, lying awake, he thought about Kim, about the morning he'd found her, about the terror he'd felt, the guilt he still carried. I should have been there. I should have protected her. And now people thought he'd done it, that he'd handcuffed his wife and slit her throat and left their baby crying in the next room. The cruelty of it was almost unbearable. The charges dropped. In late 1994, the DA quietly dropped the charges. There was no dramatic courtroom moment, no vindication speech, just a terse statement to the press, insufficient evidence to proceed. Ed was free, technically, but the damage was done. His reputation was destroyed. People who'd believed he was innocent still looked at him strangely. Maybe he got away with it. Maybe the DA just couldn't prove it. And the people who'd believed he was guilty? They were certain now. Of course they dropped the charges. Rich doctor, good lawyer. That's how the system works. Ed tried to rebuild his life. He went back to work, threw himself into raising his daughter, kept Kim's memory alive through scholarships and activism in her name. But the cloud never lifted. And the real question, the one that haunted him every day, remained unanswered. Who killed Kim? The real killer. While Ed Friedland was being arrested, tried in the court of public opinion, and ultimately released, Marion Anthony Gales was living his life. He was still in Charlotte, still in and out of jail for petty crimes, still violent, still dangerous, still the same man who'd shot a woman on Churchill Road in 1974 and murdered another on the same street in 1990. His family suspected. Years later, they'd tell investigators they'd thought all along that Marion had done it. The timing was right. He'd been in the area. The brutality fit his pattern. And there was something about the way he'd denied it, too quickly, too defensively, when Kim's murder came up in conversation. But suspicion isn't evidence. And in the 1990s, without DNA technology advanced enough to process degraded samples, Marion Gales was untouchable. He watched the news coverage of Ed Friedland's arrest with detached interest, maybe relief, maybe amusement. The police had the wrong man, and Marion knew it. He'd walked out of that house on Churchill Road, dropped the knife in a storm drain or a dumpster, gone home and carried on with his life. And no one came for him. 1995, the rediscovery. A year after Ed's charges were dropped, a cold case detective named Sarah Nguyen was assigned to the Kim Thomas file. She was new to homicide, hungry, methodical. She started from scratch, and she found the August 24, 1990 police report. Marion Anthony Gales. Name mentioned in connection with Churchill Road. No follow-up. Nguyen ran a background check. What she found made her blood run cold. Gales had a record going back to age 16. Assault, robbery, weapons charges. And in 1974, 16 years before Kim's murder, he'd shot and wounded a woman on Churchill Road, the exact same street where Kim Thomas had died. He lived in Greer Heights, a 5.5-minute walk from the Friedland house. In July 1990, the same month Kim was murdered, Gales had allegedly beaten his sister, Annie Roseborough. A pattern of violence against women. A pattern of rage. Nguyen brought Gales in for questioning. He denied everything. "I've never seen Miss Thomas before or her husband," he said, calm and flat. "I don't know anything about it." They collected his DNA. But the technology still wasn't there. The degraded samples from the crime scene rug couldn't be compared with enough certainty to charge him. The lab could say there was an unknown male contributor. They couldn't say it was Marion Gales. Nguyen knew he'd done it. She could feel it. But knowing and proving are two different things. The case stayed cold. 1997, the civil trial. Ed Friedland had been cleared by the criminal justice system, but he'd never been exonerated in the eyes of the public. So in 1997, he did something unusual. He filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Marion Gales. Civil trials have a lower burden of proof than criminal trials. In criminal court, you need evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. In civil court, you only need a preponderance of the evidence, 51% likely, more likely than not. Ed's lawyer laid out the case, Gales's proximity to the crime scene, his criminal history, his violence against women, the 1974 shooting on Churchill Road, the beating of his sister in July 1990, the timeline, the fact that police had named him in a 1990 report and never followed up. Gales's defense was thin. He denied it. He had no alibi. He had no explanation for why his name had come up in the investigation. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found Marion Gales liable for the death of Kim Thomas Friedland. The judgment, $8.6 million in damages. Ed would never see a penny. Gales had no assets to seize, but the verdict was vindication. A jury had looked at the evidence and said, this man killed Kim Thomas. But it wasn't enough for criminal charges. The DA wouldn't touch it without DNA evidence that met the beyond a reasonable doubt standard, and the DNA technology still wasn't there. Marion Gales walked out of that courtroom and went back to his life. Ed went home to his daughter and tried to explain that they'd won, but also lost. Justice had been served, but not really. The man who killed her mother was free, and Kim's family, waiting, aching, desperate, kept waiting. The years that followed, Ed raised his daughter alone. She graduated high school, went to college, built a life. She grew up without a mother, with a father who'd been wrongly accused, with a murderer walking free. The case stayed cold. Every few years, CMPD would retest the DNA as technology improved. Each time, the results were the same: unknown male contributor. Each time, Ed was definitively excluded. Each time, Marion Gales stayed out of reach. The technology just wasn't there yet, but it was coming. Epilogue: Ed Friedland had been cleared. The DNA evidence, tested and retested, had ruled him out definitively. The charges from 1994 were a stain on the justice system, a reminder that pressure to solve a case can lead to terrible mistakes. But while Ed's name had been cleared, his life had been shattered. His reputation never fully recovered. The whispers never stopped. And his daughter grew up knowing that the man who killed her mother was out there, free, living a 5-minute walk from where her mother had died. Marion Gales had been named in a 1990 police report. A civil jury had found him liable. His DNA had been collected in 1995. But the technology to prove what everyone suspected, that he'd walked into the Friedland home on a July morning in 1990, handcuffed Kim Thomas and slit her throat, didn't exist yet. So Marion Gales stayed free for 35 years, until the science finally caught up. Ed Friedland had been cleared. But the real killer, Marion Gales, who lived a 5-minute walk away and had been named in a 1990 police report, was never seriously investigated. Not yet. Word count: 4,100 words, 2,050 per chapter average. The detective had seen the file 100 times, maybe more. The Kim Thomas murder had consumed his department for 5 years, a case that should have been solved in weeks, not years. A young mother handcuffed and slaughtered in her own home. A 10-month-old baby left crying in a crib. The kind of case that haunts you. But in 1995, cold cases didn't have their own unit. They were what you did when the hot cases went cold, when the leads dried up and the phones stopped ringing. The Kim Thomas file sat in a metal cabinet in the basement of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department headquarters, gathering dust alongside dozens of other unsolved murders. Detective Carl Morrison pulled the box down on a Tuesday afternoon. He'd been assigned to review the case, again, after Dr. Ed Friedland's lawyer made another call demanding answers. 5 years since Kim's death. 4 years of investigation that had gone exactly nowhere. 1 year since they'd charged her husband with murder, only to drop the charges when the evidence wouldn't hold. Ed Friedland had become the case's ghost story, charged but never tried. Cleared but never vindicated. The orthopedic surgeon who found his wife dead and spent the next year of his life under a cloud of suspicion so dark it cost him patience, friends, and any hope of moving forward. Morrison didn't believe Ed did it. Never had. The DNA didn't match, the timeline didn't work, the motive didn't exist. But in 1990, when a woman was murdered in her home, you looked at the husband first. Sometimes you looked at him last, too, because there was nobody else to look at. The file was thick. Witness statements, crime scene photos, forensic reports, interview transcripts. Morrison had read it all before, multiple times, but cold cases weren't solved by reading the same reports over and over. They were solved by finding the thing everyone else had missed. He started at the beginning, July 27, 1990, a Friday morning that started ordinary and ended in blood. Ed Friedland left for work around 7:30 a.m. Kim was home with their daughter, a baby who wouldn't remember her mother. The Cotswold neighborhood was quiet. Middle-class homes, tree-lined streets, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors and felt safe leaving their doors unlocked. No forced entry. That detail had haunted the investigation from day one. Whoever killed Kim Thomas didn't break in. They knocked. She opened the door. Either she knew them or they gave her a reason to trust them. The handcuffs changed everything. Not police issue. Purchased somewhere, brought to the scene with intent. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was planned, controlled. The killer wanted her helpless. Her throat had been slashed, a single brutal cut. The weapon was never found. The killer took it with them, along with any hope of easy answers. Morrison flipped through the crime scene photos, forcing himself to look. After 5 years, the images had lost some of their horror, but not all of it. Kim on the floor, blood pooling on the rug, the crib visible in the background, a reminder of what her daughter had lost. The DNA evidence was there but useless. In 1990, DNA testing required large samples and perfect conditions. The blood was Kim's. The touch DNA on the handcuffs was degraded. The skin cells on the rug beside her body were too mixed, too contaminated to process. They had the killer's DNA. They just couldn't do anything with it. Morrison moved to the witness statements. Neighbors had heard nothing, seen nothing. Kim's activism work had made her visible in the community. Women's rights rallies, democratic organizing, speeches at local events, but it hadn't made her enemies. Not the kind who would handcuff her and cut her throat. Then he found it. August 24, 1990, nearly a month after the murder. A police report he'd never seen before, buried in the middle of the file. Officer Jenkins had filed it after a routine canvass of the neighborhood. The report mentioned a name, Marion Anthony Gales. The context was thin. A neighbor had mentioned seeing Gales in the area around the time of the murder. Jenkins had noted it, filed it, and apparently nobody had followed up. Morrison felt his pulse quicken. Marion Gales. The name meant nothing to him. He ran the name through the system. The screen filled with records. Assault, robbery, weapons charges, drug offenses. Marion Anthony Gales had a criminal history stretching back to 1974, when he was 16 years old. Morrison kept reading. Then he stopped. 1974. Marion Gales, age 16, convicted of shooting a woman on Churchill Road. Churchill Road. The same street where Kim Thomas had lived, the same street where she'd been murdered 16 years later. Morrison's hands went still on the keyboard. His coffee had gone cold an hour ago. This couldn't be coincidence. He pulled up Gale's address from 1990, Greer Heights, a neighborhood southeast of Cotswold. He opened Google Maps and typed in the addresses, the cursor shaking slightly. 5.5 minutes. Walking distance from Marion Gale's apartment to Kim Thomas's front door was 5.5 minutes. Morrison printed everything. Criminal records, addresses, case files. Then he started making calls. Marion Gale's criminal history read like a roadmap to violence. At 16, he'd shot a woman in broad daylight on Churchill Road. The victim survived but never fully recovered. Gales served time in juvenile detention and was released at 18 with a record that should have been a warning. Throughout his 20s, the arrests piled up. Bar fights, armed robbery, possession with intent to distribute. Every few years, Gales would disappear into the prison system for a year or two, then emerge and start the cycle again. But it was the pattern that made Morrison's stomach turn. Violence against women, over and over. In 1985, a woman told police that Marion Gales had raped her. She described the attack in detail, how he'd forced his way into her apartment, overpowered her, threatened to kill her if she screamed. The detective who took her statement believed her. But the woman never pressed charges. She was terrified. Gales had told her he knew where she lived, where she worked, where her mother lived. She moved out of Charlotte 2 weeks later. No charges filed, no arrest. Just another report in a system that couldn't protect her. Then came July 1990. The same month Kim Thomas was murdered. Morrison found the domestic violence report buried in Gales's file. July 14, 1990. 13 days before Kim's murder, Annie Roseborough, Marion's sister, called 911 from a neighbor's house. She told the responding officer that her brother had beaten her during an argument about money. He'd hit her in the face, knocked her down, kicked her while she was on the floor. She had bruises on her ribs, a black eye, a split lip. Did she want to press charges? No, she was afraid. Marion had told her he'd kill her if she sent him back to jail. The officer filed the report and left. Annie Roseborough refused medical treatment. Marion Gales faced no consequences. 2 weeks later, Kim Thomas was handcuffed and murdered in her home. Morrison built a timeline on the whiteboard in the conference room. The pattern was unmistakable. 1974, Gales shoots woman on Churchill Road, age 16. 1975 to 1989, in and out of jail, multiple violent offenses. 1985, rape allegation, woman too afraid to press charges. July 14, 1990, beats his sister Annie. July 27, 1990, Kim Thomas murdered. August 24, 1990, neighbor mentions seeing Gales in area. Report filed, not acted on. Morrison stared at the board. Marion Gales was 28 years old in 1990. He lived a 5-minute walk from the victim. He had a history of violence against women. He had shot someone on the same street 16 years earlier. He was violent enough to beat his own sister 2 weeks before the murder. and nobody had talked to him. The interview room at CMPD headquarters was designed to be uncomfortable. Hard chairs, fluorescent lights, no windows, a table bolted to the floor. Marion Gales sat across from Morrison, looking bored. He was 33 now, 5 years older than when Kim Thomas died. Prison had aged him. Tattoos, scars, a hardness around the eyes that came from too many fights in too many cells. He'd been picked up on a parole violation 3 days earlier and was waiting to be transferred back to the prison system when Morrison requested the interview. "You know why you're here?" Morrison asked. Gales shrugged. "You tell me." Kim Thomas, July 27, 1990. Ring a bell? Nope. Morrison slid a photo across the table. Kim's driver's license photo, taken a year before her death, smiling, alive, unaware of what was coming. Gales looked at it without expression. "Never seen her. She lived on Churchill Road, Cotswold. You know the street?" Something flickered across Gales' face. "Maybe. I know a lot of streets. You shot a woman on Churchill Road in 1974. You were 16. Gales leaned back in his chair. "That was a long time ago. 20 years. You remember it? I served my time." Morrison opened the file and pulled out the map he'd printed. 2 addresses circled in red. "This is where Kim Thomas lived. This is where you lived in 1990. 5.5-minute walk. You're telling me you never saw her? I'm telling you I don't know her. You were in the neighborhood on July 27, 1990. Says who? A neighbor saw you." Gales smiled. "Then arrest me." Morrison wanted to. Everything in him wanted to slap cuffs on this man and drag him to a cell. But wanting wasn't enough. He had proximity. History, a neighbor's vague recollection. None of it was enough. "We're going to need a DNA sample," Morrison said. "Why?" "Because we have DNA from the crime scene. If you didn't do it, the test will prove it." Gales considered this. Then he shrugged. "Fine, take your sample. I got nothing to hide." Morrison called in the crime scene tech. Gales opened his mouth, let them swab his cheek, signed the consent form without reading it. He wasn't worried, and that made Morrison's skin crawl. "I've never seen Miss Thomas before, or her husband," Gales said as Morrison walked him back to holding. "I don't know anything about it." Morrison watched him go. Marion Gales walked like a man who knew he was untouchable, because in 1995, he was. The DNA results came back 6 weeks later. Morrison opened the report with hands that shook slightly. This was it, the break they needed. Marion Gales' DNA compared against the unknown male profile from the crime scene. If they matched, they had their killer. If they didn't, Morrison was back to square one. He read the first line, then the second. Then he put the report down and closed his eyes. Insufficient sample quality for comparison. The DNA from the crime scene, the skin cells on the rug, the touch DNA on the handcuffs, was too degraded. Mixed with Kim's DNA, contaminated by 5 years of storage, broken down by time and temperature and the limitations of 1995 forensic technology. The crime lab director called an hour later. "I'm sorry, Carl. We tried everything. The technology just isn't there yet." "What do I tell the family?" "Tell them we're keeping the evidence. Tell them that DNA technology is improving every year. Tell them that someday, maybe, we'll be able to test it." Morrison hung up and walked to the conference room where his timeline still covered the whiteboard. Marion Gales' name at the center of it all. They had their suspect. They knew he did it. The proximity, the history, the pattern, it all pointed to him. A violent man with a history of assaulting women, who lived a 5-minute walk from the victim, who had committed violence on that same street before. But knowing wasn't proving, and in criminal justice, you needed proof beyond reasonable doubt. Marion Gales walked out of CMPD headquarters 3 days later, his parole violation sentence served. Morrison watched him leave through the window of his office. The man who killed Kim Thomas was free. And there was nothing Morrison could do about it. Ed Friedland's lawyer had an idea that sounded crazy. That's what Ed thought when Barry Goldman first pitched it in his office overlooking downtown Charlotte. "We sue him." Ed stared at him. "Sue who?" "Marion Gales. Wrongful death. Civil court. They can't even charge him criminally. How are we supposed to?" "Different burden of proof," Goldman interrupted. He was in his 50s, gray at the temples, with the kind of confidence that came from winning cases nobody thought he could win. "Criminal court requires proof beyond reasonable doubt. That's a high bar, 95% certain, maybe higher. But civil court, preponderance of evidence, 51% likely. We don't have to prove he did it beyond all doubt. We just have to prove it's more likely than not. Ed was quiet for a long moment. It had been 7 years since Kim's death. 7 years of police investigations, false accusations, DNA tests that went nowhere. 7 years of watching his daughter grow up without her mother while the man who killed her walked free. Will it work? Ed asked. I don't know, Goldman said honestly, but it's the only shot we have. They filed the lawsuit in February 1997. Ed Friedland v. Marion Anthony Gales. Wrongful death. Damages, $8.6 million. The number wasn't arbitrary. Goldman had calculated lost wages, lost companionship, pain and suffering, the cost of raising their daughter alone. You couldn't put a price on Kim's life, but the law required you to try. Marion Gales was served with the lawsuit at his apartment in Greer Heights. According to the process server, Gales read the papers, laughed, and threw them in the trash. Tell that doctor he ain't getting shit from me, Gales said. He was probably right. Marion Gales had no assets. No house, no car, no bank account with more than a few $100s. Even if they won, collecting the judgment would be nearly impossible. But that wasn't the point. The point was justice. The point was a jury saying out loud what the police couldn't prove. Marion Gales killed Kim Thomas. The trial began on a Monday morning in October 1997. Mecklenburg County Superior Court Civil Division. Judge Patricia Crawford presiding. The courtroom was older, wood-paneled, with high ceilings and uncomfortable benches that creaked when you shifted your weight. The jury box held 12 citizens of Charlotte, summoned from their regular lives to decide whether a man was responsible for a woman's death. Ed sat at the plaintiff's table with Barry Goldman and 2 associates. He wore a suit he'd bought for the occasion. 7 years since Kim's death, and this was the closest he'd come to a trial. His own trial, the one where he'd been charged with murder, had never happened. The DA dropped charges before it reached a courtroom. No evidence, no case. This time, there was evidence, and there was a case. Marion Gales sat at the defense table with a court-appointed attorney who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Gales wore an orange jumpsuit. He'd been picked up on a drug charge 3 weeks before trial and was being held without bond. He slouched in his chair, arms crossed, looking bored. Barry Goldman stood for his opening statement. On July 27, 1990, Kim Thomas Friedland was murdered in her home. She was 32 years old. She was a mother, a wife, a women's rights activist who fought for equality and justice. She was handcuffed behind her back and her throat was slashed. Her 10-month-old daughter was in a crib in the next room, unaware that her mother had just been taken from her. The jury was listening. Ed could see it in their faces. Horror, sympathy, anger. The Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department investigated this murder for 7 years. They collected evidence. They interviewed witnesses. They tested DNA. And every piece of evidence pointed to one man, Marion Anthony Gales. Goldman turned and pointed at Gales. The defendant didn't flinch. Marion Gales lived a 5.5-minute walk from Kim Thomas's home. He had a history of violence against women stretching back to age 16. In 1974, he shot a woman on Churchill Road, the same street where Kim Thomas lived and died. In 1985, a woman accused him of rape. In July 1990, the same month Kim was murdered, Marion Gales beat his own sister so badly she required medical attention. Goldman paused, letting that sink in. On July 27, 1990, Marion Gales was seen in the area of Churchill Road around the time of Kim's murder. When police finally questioned him in 1995, he denied ever seeing Kim Thomas. But the evidence tells a different story. The evidence says Marion Gales killed Kim Thomas, and that's what we're here to prove. The defense attorney stood. His opening statement was shorter. The police couldn't charge my client because they have no evidence. They have suspicions. They have theories. They have a man with a criminal record who lived in the same neighborhood. That's not evidence. That's prejudice. The burden of proof in this case is still on the plaintiff. They have to prove it's more likely than not that Marion Gales is responsible. And they can't. Because he isn't. He sat down. Ed glanced at Goldman, who gave him a small nod. This was going to be a fight. The trial lasted 6 days. Barry Goldman called 23 witnesses. crime scene investigators who explained the forensics, neighbors who testified to seeing Marion Gales in the area, the detective who interviewed Gales in 1995, expert witnesses who explained DNA technology and why the evidence couldn't be processed in 1995 but might be someday. They called Annie Roseborough, Marion's sister. She was 40 now, graying at the temples with the kind of tired eyes that came from a lifetime of violence. She testified about July 14, 1990, the day her brother beat her. "Did you tell the police what happened?" Goldman asked. "No." "Why not?" "I was scared. Marion said he'd kill me if I pressed charges." "Did you believe him?" Annie looked at her brother across the courtroom. Marion stared back, expressionless. "Yes." Goldman showed her the domestic violence report filed by the responding officer. "This report says you refused medical treatment. Is that true?" "I went to the hospital the next day. I had 3 broken ribs and a concussion." The jury shifted in their seats. Ed watched one woman, late 50s, grandmother type, look at Marion Gales with something close to hatred. The defense attorney tried to poke holes in the case. He pointed out that the neighbor who claimed to see Gales in the area couldn't say for certain what day it was. He argued that proximity wasn't proof. Half the neighborhood lived within a 10-minute walk. He emphasized that the DNA evidence was inconclusive, that no murder weapon had been found, that Marion Gales had denied involvement. "Innocent until proven guilty," the defense attorney said in his closing argument. "That's the standard in criminal court, and it should be the standard here. You can't convict a man based on his past. You can't convict a man because he lived in the wrong neighborhood. You can't convict a man because the police need someone to blame." Barry Goldman's closing argument was different. This isn't about innocence or guilt. This is about responsibility. Kim Thomas is dead. Someone killed her. Someone handcuffed her, cut her throat, left her to bleed out on the floor while her baby cried in the next room. Someone did that. The question isn't whether Marion Gales is a bad person. We all know he is. The question is, did he do this? Goldman walked the jury through the evidence again, the geography, the timeline, the history of violence, the interview where Gales denied ever seeing Kim Thomas, even though he lived 5 minutes away and had committed violence on her street before. Ask yourselves, is it more likely than not that Marion Gales killed Kim Thomas? Not beyond all doubt, not with 100% certainty, but more likely than not, 51%. Preponderance of evidence, that's the standard, and the evidence meets it. He paused, looking at each juror in turn. Kim Thomas can't speak for herself. She can't tell you what happened that morning. She can't tell you who knocked on her door, who she opened it for, who handcuffed her and killed her. But the evidence can speak for her, and it says Marion Gales is responsible. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. Ed spent that time in a conference room down the hall from the courtroom, unable to eat or sleep or think about anything except what would happen if they lost. 7 years of grief, 7 years of investigation, 7 years of waiting, all of it coming down to 12 strangers in a room deciding whether his wife's death meant anything. At 4:17 p.m. on the second day of deliberations, the bailiff knocked on the door. "We have a verdict." Ed's hands shook as he walked back into the courtroom. The jury filed in slowly, avoiding eye contact with both tables. Judge Crawford took her seat. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman stood. He was a man in his 60s, gray hair, wearing a tie that looked uncomfortable. "We have, Your Honor." "In the case of Friedland v. Gales, on the charge of wrongful death, how do you find?" The foreman looked down at the paper in his hands. "We find the defendant, Marion Anthony Gales, liable for the death of Kim Thomas Friedland." Ed felt his breath leave his body. Liable, they'd said it. A jury had said it out loud. "And what damages do you award?" Judge Crawford asked. $8.6 million. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled for the doors. Family members wept. Ed sat frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Marion Gales stood slowly, his face unreadable. His attorney put a hand on his shoulder, but Gales shrugged it off. He turned and looked directly at Ed. Then he smiled. It was a small smile, barely visible, but it said everything. "You think you won? I'll never pay a dime. I'll never see the inside of a prison for this. You got your verdict, but I'm still walking out of here." And he was right. The judgment was filed 3 days later. Ed Friedland of Marion Anthony Gales liable, $8.6 million in damages. Barry Goldman filed the paperwork to collect. He put liens on any property Gales might acquire, garnishments on any wages he might earn, holds on any bank accounts in his name. Marion Gales had nothing. No house, no car, no job, no assets. The judgment was a piece of paper and nothing more. 2 weeks after the verdict, Gales was released from jail on the drug charge, time served. He walked out of Mecklenburg County Jail wearing the same clothes he'd worn at trial. Ed watched the news coverage from his living room. A reporter shoved a microphone in Gales's face. "What do you have to say about the verdict?" "I didn't kill that woman," Gales said. "The jury got it wrong." "Do you plan to appeal?" Gales laughed. "With what money?" He walked away, free. A jury had said he was responsible for Kim Thomas's death. An $8.6 million judgment said he owed. But criminal charges required a higher standard of proof, and the DNA technology wasn't there yet. Marion Gales went back to his life. Ed went back to his. The years passed slowly. 1998, 1999, 2000. Each anniversary of Kim's death felt like reopening a wound that had never fully healed. Ed marked the dates quietly, private memorials, flowers at her grave, phone calls with her parents who were aging now, worn down by grief that had no resolution. Marion Gales kept getting arrested. Drug possession, assault, parole violations, in and out of the prison system, never gone for long, always coming back. Every time Ed heard about another arrest, he felt a flash of hope. Maybe this time they'll charge him. They never did. The DNA evidence sat in the CMPD crime lab, preserved in a temperature-controlled room, waiting for technology to catch up. Every few years, a new detective would call Ed. They'd retested the evidence. Still inconclusive, still degraded, still insufficient for criminal charges. But the technology is improving, they always said. Someday. Ed's daughter grew up, graduated high school, went to college, built a life that Kim would never see. Ed remarried, a good woman who understood that part of his heart would always belong to his first wife. They didn't talk about the case often. There was nothing new to say. But in 2008, something changed. The CMPD crime lab got a new director. Matthew Mathis, young, ambitious, with a background in cutting-edge forensic technology. One of his first initiatives was to review every cold case with DNA evidence, using the latest testing methods. Kim Thomas' case went to the front of the line. The new tests came back in September 2008. Ed got the call from Detective Morrison, who'd never stopped working the case even after he retired. "The DNA definitively excludes you," Morrison said. "I know you were already cleared, but this is absolute. No question. Zero chance you were involved." Ed had known that for 18 years, but hearing it again, backed by science that didn't exist in 1990, felt like an exoneration he hadn't known he needed. "What about Gales?" "Still working on it. The technology is better, but we're not there yet." Not yet. Always not yet. The breakthrough came in 2022, though Ed didn't know it at the time. The CMPD crime lab acquired probabilistic genotyping software, a new technology that used complex mathematical algorithms and biological modeling to analyze DNA samples that were previously unusable. Degraded samples, mixed samples, trace amounts from touch DNA, the kind of evidence that had been sitting in the Kim Thomas file for 32 years. Director Matthew Mathis personally selected the case for reanalysis. The rug from beside Kim's body, the handcuffs, the swabs taken from surfaces in the room, all of it retested using software that hadn't existed when the evidence was collected. The analysis took 3 years, multiple rounds of testing, cross-checking, verification by outside labs. The science was new enough that it had to be bulletproof before they could bring charges. In February 2026, the final report was completed. Marion Anthony Gales' DNA, on the rug beside Kim Thomas's body. Statistical probability, quadrillions to 1. Detective Morrison, retired for 15 years but still on the department's contact list, got the call first. Then they called Ed. "We're arresting him," the current detective said. "Tomorrow morning. 35 years late, but we're doing it." Ed sat down slowly in his kitchen chair. His wife, his second wife, the woman who'd helped him rebuild a life after Kim, put her hand on his shoulder. "When?" Ed asked. "Tomorrow. We're sending the Violent Criminal Apprehension Team to pick him up at 6 a.m. Ed hung up and stared at the calendar on the wall. February 18th, 2026. 35 years, 6 months, and 22 days since Kim died. Marion Anthony Gales was 64 years old when they arrested him. He was living in a small apartment in East Charlotte alone, surviving on disability payments and whatever money he could make doing odd jobs that didn't require background checks. His body had aged badly. Decades of drugs and violence and prison had left him with bad knees, worse lungs, and a face that looked older than his years. The VCAP team knocked on his door at 6:04 a.m. on February 19, 2026. Gales opened the door in boxers and an undershirt, squinting against the early morning light. "Marion Anthony Gales?" "Yeah?" "You're under arrest for the murder of Kim Thomas Friedland." They read him his rights while they cuffed him. Gales didn't resist. He stood there in his doorway, hands behind his back, looking confused. "This is about that lady from 1990? "Yes, sir." "I already beat that case. You can't try me twice." "You were never tried," the detective said. "You were found liable in civil court, but never charged criminally, until now." They walked him to the car. Neighbors watched from their windows. The news crews wouldn't arrive for another hour, but cell phone videos were already starting to circulate online. Marion Gales sat in the back of the police car, handcuffed, the same way Kim Thomas had been handcuffed 35 years earlier. This time, the cuffs stayed on. The press conference was held at noon on February 20th, 2026. CMPD headquarters briefing room, packed with reporters from local and national media. The Kim Thomas case had been a legend in Charlotte true crime circles for decades. The cold case that DNA couldn't solve, the civil verdict that meant nothing, the killer who walked free. Deputy Chief Ryan Butler stood at the podium. "This morning, our violent criminal apprehension team located and arrested Marion Anthony Gales based on work done by our cold case homicide detectives and our crime laboratory. Mr. Gales has been charged with first-degree murder in the death of Kim Thomas Friedland, who was killed in her home on July 27, 1990. The room erupted with questions. Butler held up a hand. The breakthrough came from new DNA analysis technology called probabilistic genotyping. This software allowed our lab to analyze degraded evidence that was collected at the crime scene 35 years ago, but couldn't be processed with the technology available at the time. Crime Lab Director Matthew Mathis stepped to the microphone. "We're now able to develop DNA profiles from evidence that we couldn't develop profiles from 20 years ago," Mathis explained. "In this case, we were able to analyze trace DNA from the crime scene and match it definitively to the suspect. The statistical probability is high enough to meet the threshold for criminal prosecution." A reporter called out, "Why did it take 35 years?" "Because the technology didn't exist," Mathis said simply. "We preserved the evidence properly. We continued testing as new methods became available. We never stopped working this case, and finally, science caught up." Ed Friedland declined to attend the press conference. He issued a statement through Barry Goldman, his attorney. "For 35 years, my family has waited for justice. We are grateful to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department and the Crime Lab for their persistence and dedication. While this arrest cannot bring Kim back, it is a measure of closure that we have desperately needed. Kim was a mother, an activist, and a force for good in this world. She deserved better than to die the way she did, and she deserved better than to wait 35 years for her killer to face justice." Marion Gales was arraigned on February 21, 2026. He pleaded not guilty. Bond was denied. The trial was scheduled for late 2026, though legal experts predicted delays and appeals that could push it into 2027 or beyond. In his cell at Mecklenburg County Jail, Marion Gales told a cellmate that the whole thing was bullshit, that he'd never touched Kim Thomas, that the DNA was contaminated, that they were framing him because they needed someone to blame. The cellmate reported the conversation to a guard, who included it in a report that would eventually be used at trial. Ed Friedland stood at Kim's grave on July 27, 2026, 36 years to the day since her death. His daughter stood beside him, 36 years old now, the same age her mother never reached. Flowers covered the headstone, not just from family, but from strangers who'd followed the case, who'd read about the arrest, who wanted to honor a woman they'd never met. "Do you think it's enough?" his daughter asked. Ed didn't answer right away. Was it enough? 36 years of waiting, a civil verdict that meant nothing, a criminal arrest that came 3 decades too late. Marion Gales would likely spend the rest of his life in prison, but how much life did he have left? He was 64, in poor health, with nothing to lose. Kim had died at 32. She'd missed her daughter's childhood, her daughter's graduation, her daughter's wedding. She'd missed 36 years of life because a violent man who lived 5 minutes away had decided to take it from her. "No," Ed said finally, "it's not enough, but it's what we have." They stood there for a long time, father and daughter, at the grave of the woman who connected them, the woman whose murder had defined both their lives in ways neither of them had asked for. Marion Gales had been found liable for Kim Thomas's murder. A jury said he did it. An $8.6 million judgment said he owed, but he walked free because DNA technology wasn't advanced enough to prove it beyond reasonable doubt. Not yet. 35 years later, not yet had finally become now. Justice had arrived. Late, incomplete, and inadequate. But it had arrived. The evidence sat in a temperature-controlled vault at the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department Crime Laboratory, carefully preserved in sealed bags and labeled with case numbers that dated back to 1990. A blood-stained rug, fiber samples, swabs from surfaces in a Cotswold home where Kim Thomas had died with her hands cuffed behind her back. For nearly 2 decades, that evidence waited in the dark, holding secrets that science wasn't yet ready to reveal. In 2008, everything changed. Matthew Mathis arrived at the CMPD crime lab as its new director with a mandate to modernize. DNA technology had evolved exponentially since the 1990s, moving from crude analysis requiring massive blood samples to sophisticated testing that could extract profiles from skin cells invisible to the naked eye. What had once seemed like science fiction, reading genetic code from a fingerprint's residue from the microscopic debris left when someone touched a doorknob, was now routine. Mathis knew the lab's evidence vault contained hundreds of cold cases, samples collected before DNA technology could make sense of them. Kim Thomas's murder was at the top of his list. "We need to retest everything," Mathis told his team that first year. "The science has changed. What we couldn't see in 1990 might be visible now." The Kim Thomas case had haunted Charlotte for 18 years. The 32-year-old women's rights activist murdered in her own home, her 10-month-old baby crying in the crib nearby. The husband charged, then cleared. A civil jury finding Marion Gales liable in 1997, awarding $8.6 million that would never be paid. But criminal charges required proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and the DNA evidence from 1990 simply couldn't deliver that certainty. Not yet. When the samples arrived in Mathis's lab in 2008, technicians handled them with the reverence of archaeologists examining ancient artifacts. The rug that had been beside Kim's body yielded traces of DNA, degraded, fragmentary, mixed with multiple contributors. In 1990, that sample would have been useless. Even in 2000, it would have told them almost nothing. But in 2008, they could finally see inside. The first round of testing took months. New extraction methods pulled genetic material from samples that previous technology would have discarded as too contaminated or too small. PCR amplification, copying tiny fragments of DNA millions of times until they could be analyzed, revealed profiles that had been invisible 18 years earlier. The results were both vindicating and frustrating. Dr. Ed Friedland, Kim's husband, was definitively excluded as a contributor to the DNA found at the crime scene. Not probably excluded. Not likely excluded. Definitively. The genetic markers didn't match. The man who had found his wife's body, who had been charged with her murder in 1994, who had lived under a cloud of suspicion even after charges were dropped, that man was innocent. The DNA proved it. But the DNA also revealed something that would torment investigators for another 18 years. There was an unknown male contributor. Someone else had been in that house. Someone else had left genetic material on the rug beside Kim's body. They just couldn't figure out who. The problem was degradation. DNA breaks down over time, especially when exposed to moisture, heat, or contamination. The samples from Kim's murder scene had sat in evidence bags for 18 years. Some markers were clear, others were fragmentary or mixed with DNA from other sources. Kim's own genetic material, possibly transferred DNA from people who had innocently been in the house before the murder. Standard DNA analysis in 2008 required clear, unmixed samples, a single contributor, clean markers across enough genetic loci to generate a profile that could be searched in CODIS, the FBI's Combined DNA Index System database. Mixed samples, DNA from multiple people in the same spot, were notoriously difficult to interpret. Which peaks belonged to which person? Where did one genetic profile end and another begin? The rug sample showed a mix, predominantly one unknown male, but with other contributors complicating the picture. The technology of 2008 could tell them the DNA was there. It couldn't tell them who it belonged to. It's like having a fingerprint smudged across a surface. Mathis explained to cold case detectives, "You can see it's there. You can see it's not Ed Friedland's, but you can't lift a clean print for comparison." The detectives asked the obvious question, "Can we test it against Marion Gale's?" They could. They did. The results were inconclusive. Not a definitive match. Not a definitive exclusion. The statistical probability calculations that courts required for criminal prosecution couldn't reach the threshold of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The science showed something was there, something that might match Gale's, might not, but the word might doesn't convict anyone. Ed Friedland finally had scientific proof of his innocence. His daughter, now 18 years old, could know with certainty that her father hadn't killed her mother. But knowing who had killed Kim Thomas remained just out of reach. "The technology isn't there yet," Mathis told the family, "but it will be." Throughout the 2010s, the Kim Thomas case returned to the lab every time DNA technology took another leap forward. Each new breakthrough prompted the same conversation among cold case detectives. Can we retest Kim Thomas? 2010 brought improved analysis of touch DNA, the genetic material left behind by simple contact, skin cells sloughed off when someone grabs a doorknob or handles an object. The rug was retested. The profile refined slightly, but not enough. 2012 saw advances in separating mixed samples, using statistical software to calculate the probability that certain genetic markers belong to certain contributors. The rug went back to the lab. The calculations narrowed. Still not enough for court. 2015 introduced Y-STR testing, analyzing markers on the male Y chromosome to create profiles when mixed male-female DNA contaminated samples. More testing, more refinement. The unknown male's profile grew clearer with each iteration, like an old photograph gradually coming into focus as restoration technology improved. But clear enough to make an arrest? Not yet. The frustration was existential. They knew the killer's DNA. It was right there in the evidence vault, stored in sealed bags, cataloged and preserved. The killer had left part of himself at the crime scene, microscopic fragments of skin, the cellular debris that every human sheds constantly, the genetic signature that was as unique as a signature on a confession. They could see it. They just couldn't read it well enough to use it. Ed Friedland attended every briefing, absorbing the technical details with the focus of a physician accustomed to complex science. He understood degradation and contamination, statistical thresholds, and probabilistic analysis. He understood that DNA evidence in court had to meet standards that couldn't be compromised, that the difference between probably the killer and definitely the killer was the difference between justice and wrongful conviction. He understood, but understanding didn't make the waiting easier. "My daughter is growing up without her mother," he told Mathis during one meeting. "She's in college now. Kim missed her first steps, her first words, her first day of school, her graduation. And the man who did this is out there somewhere, living his life, while we wait for computers to get better at math." Mathis had no comfort to offer except the truth. Science doesn't care about our schedule. It advances at its own pace, but it does advance. The database searches yielded nothing. Marion Gale's DNA profile from his 1995 interview was in local records, but the system couldn't make a definitive match with the degraded crime scene sample. CODIS searches for the unknown male DNA came back empty. The killer either had no criminal record requiring DNA submission, or his DNA had been collected for offense types that weren't entered into the database. It was the worst kind of evidence, proof that someone had been there, proof that the someone wasn't Ed Friedland, but no way to prove who the someone was. Cold case detectives knew Gales was their man. The 1997 civil trial had laid out the case comprehensively. Gales lived a 5.5-minute walk from the murder scene. He had shot a woman on the same street 16 years earlier. He had a rape allegation in 1985. He had allegedly beaten his sister the same month Kim was murdered. His family members told police they suspected him. But suspicion doesn't equal proof. Civil liability doesn't equal criminal conviction. The jury in 1997 had decided it was more likely than not that Gales killed Kim Thomas. Criminal court required certainty beyond a reasonable doubt. The DNA could provide that certainty if they could just read it clearly enough. Every year I pull the file, one cold case detective said in 2018, 28 years after the murder. Every year I ask the lab if there's new technology. Every year they tell me they're working on it. And every year Marion Gales wakes up a free man. Gales, for his part, continued denying any involvement. In occasional interviews with police and journalists, he maintained the same story he'd told since 1995. I've never seen Miss Thomas before or her husband. I don't know anything about it. He didn't have to know anything about it. The legal system placed the burden of proof on the prosecution. Without DNA confirmation that could survive court scrutiny, Gales could deny forever. The technological gap that saved him was narrowing every year, but slowly, incrementally, with advances measured in refined algorithms and improved software rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Each new iteration of DNA analysis brought the profile one step closer to courtroom readiness. But one step wasn't enough. Justice required the full distance. By 2020, 30 years after Kim Thomas's murder, Matthew Mathis had been running the CMPD crime lab for more than a decade. The Kim Thomas case had become something of a white whale, the one that got away, the evidence sample that held answers just tantalizingly out of reach. We know what we need, Mathis told his team during a 2020 review of cold cases. We need software that can model degraded DNA mathematically. We need algorithms that can separate mixed profiles probabilistically. We need to move beyond simple yes-no matching and into statistical likelihood analysis that courts will accept. That technology existed. It was called probabilistic genotyping, and crime labs across the country were beginning to adopt it. The software used complex mathematical modeling to analyze DNA samples that traditional methods couldn't interpret. Degraded samples, trace samples, mixed samples with multiple contributors. Instead of requiring clear, unmixed genetic markers, probabilistic genotyping could look at ambiguous data and calculate the statistical likelihood that certain combinations of markers came from certain individuals. It could model how DNA degrades, how mixtures occur, how transfer DNA and contamination affect samples. It could take a smudged fingerprint and mathematically reconstruct what the original clear print might have looked like. It was exactly what the Kim Thomas case needed. The software wasn't cheap. Implementation required extensive training. Validation studies had to prove the technology met forensic standards. And courts were still grappling with how to evaluate probabilistic evidence. How to explain to juries that a quadrillion to one likelihood was as good as certainty. But by 2021, Mathis knew it was time. The technology had matured, the case law was solidifying, and most importantly, Kim Thomas's killer had been free for 31 years. If probabilistic genotyping could finally read the DNA on that rug, the wait would be over. In 2022, the CMPD crime lab acquired the software. The Kim Thomas case was first in line. This wasn't possible 20 years ago, Mathis would later say. It wasn't even possible 10 years ago. But now we can finally see what's been there all along. The evidence bags came out of the vault one more time. The rug sample that had been tested and retested for 32 years returned to the lab bench. Technicians extracted DNA using the latest protocols, generating data that would feed into algorithms designed to solve exactly this kind of problem. And for the first time since 1990, the science was ready to answer the question that had haunted a family, a community, and a police department for more than 3 decades. Who killed Kim Thomas? The computer began its calculations. The answer was coming. The mathematics of DNA had always been probabilistic, even when forensic scientists spoke in certainties. A match was never truly absolute. It was a statistical calculation that the probability of someone else having the same genetic profile was so vanishingly small as to be functionally impossible. 1 in a billion, 1 in a trillion. Odds so long that saying match became scientifically acceptable shorthand for so close to certain that the distinction doesn't matter. But those calculations assumed clean data, clear genetic markers, single contributor samples where every peak on the electropherogram, the graph showing DNA fragment sizes, could be confidently attributed to one person. The math was straightforward when the data was clear. The Kim Thomas evidence was anything but clear. When CMPD crime lab technicians loaded the rug sample into the probabilistic genotyping software in 2023, they were asking the system to do what human analysts couldn't: make sense of ambiguity. The software, developed by forensic technology companies and refined through thousands of validation studies, used algorithms that modeled the biological and chemical realities of DNA analysis. How does DNA degrade over time? How do enzymatic processes break genetic material into fragments? When multiple people's DNA mixes in a single sample, how do you separate the contributors mathematically? When transferred DNA, genetic material deposited indirectly, like when someone touches an object that then touches something else, complicates a sample, how do you account for that probabilistically? The software didn't guess. It calculated billions of permutations, testing every possible combination of genetic markers against known principles of how DNA behaves. It generated likelihood ratios, mathematical expressions of how probable it was that a given person contributed to the sample compared to how probable it was that a random person did. For the first few months, the system crunched through the Kim Thomas data, generating profiles and probability calculations that were reviewed by technicians, then reviewed again, then validated against control samples. Forensic DNA analysis doesn't move quickly. Every step requires documentation. Every conclusion requires peer review. But by late 2023, the picture was becoming clear. The rug sample contained DNA from multiple contributors, as expected: Kim Thomas herself, whose body had lain on the rug, possible transfer DNA from people who had innocently been in the house, and one primary unknown male contributor. The software separated these profiles mathematically, isolating the genetic markers most likely to belong to each person. And the primary male contributor's profile was strong enough for comparison. Matthew Mathis reviewed the preliminary results with the caution of someone who had waited 15 years for this moment. Every forensic scientist knows the danger of confirmation bias, seeing what you want to see in ambiguous data. The Kim Thomas case came with decades of assumptions and theories. Everyone believed Marion Gales was the killer. The civil trial had declared him liable. But belief wasn't proof, and Mathis's job was to follow the science wherever it led, even if it contradicted 30 years of investigation. "Run it again," he told his team. "Different parameters, different software version. I want independent validation." They ran it again and again. Each time, the probabilistic genotyping software isolated the same primary male profile from the degraded mixture on the rug. Each time, the statistical calculations pointed in the same direction. By early 2024, Mathis knew they had something solid enough to take the next step. "Compare it to Marion Gales," he instructed. Gales's reference DNA sample from 1995 went into the system. The software compared his genetic profile to the primary male contributor profile extracted from the rug sample. It calculated the likelihood ratio. How much more probable was it that Marion Gales contributed the DNA on that rug compared to a random, unrelated person? The number that came back was astronomical: quadrillions to 1. To understand what that means requires understanding the scale of human genetic diversity. While every person's DNA is unique, except for identical twins, people share many genetic markers. Common ancestry means that certain combinations of markers appear more frequently in populations than others. This is why DNA matches are expressed as probabilities rather than absolutes. There's always a theoretical chance, however microscopic, that two unrelated people could share enough markers to look like a match. But quadrillions to 1 pushes probability into the realm of practical certainty. The world population is under 8 billion. A quadrillion is 1,000 trillion. The odds that someone other than Marion Gales contributed the primary male DNA on the rug beside Kim Thomas's body were so small that they exceeded the number of humans who had ever lived. It was proof. Finally, after 34 years, it was proof. The validation process took another year. Forensic DNA evidence that will be used in a murder trial must survive intense scrutiny, from defense attorneys who will challenge every assumption, from judges who will evaluate whether the science meets legal standards for admissibility, from juries who will need to understand complex statistical concepts. Mathis brought in outside experts to review the analysis. He sent samples to independent labs for confirmation using different software platforms. He documented every step of the process, who ran which test, when, using which protocols, with which control standards. The chain of custody for evidence that had sat in a vault for 35 years had to be airtight. By late 2025, the file was ready. The DNA report laid out the findings in language precise enough for scientists and clear enough for prosecutors. Marion Anthony Gales's DNA profile matched the primary male contributor profile extracted from the rug beside Kim Thomas's body. The statistical probability that someone other than Gales contributed that DNA was less than 1 in a quadrillion. The technology that didn't exist in 1990, that couldn't have existed in 1990, because the mathematical algorithms and biological models hadn't been developed yet, had finally caught up to the evidence. On February 17, 2026, the DNA report arrived at the Cold Case Homicide Unit of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. Detectives who had spent years reviewing the file, interviewing witnesses, keeping the case alive even as leads dried up and Marion Gales aged into his 60s, those detectives finally had what they needed. The arrest warrant was prepared within hours. First-degree murder, the charge that carries the possibility of life in prison. The charge that North Carolina treats with the solemnity it deserves, requiring proof beyond any reasonable doubt that the accused committed an intentional, premeditated killing. The DNA was that proof. Detectives briefed the Violent Criminal Apprehension Team, the unit responsible for tracking down and arresting dangerous suspects. Marion Gales was 64 years old now, no longer the 28-year-old who had lived a 5.5-minute walk from Kim Thomas's house in 1990. But his criminal history remained extensive, and police don't take chances with murder suspects. On February 19, 2026, the apprehension team located Gales at his residence in Charlotte. He was arrested without incident, handcuffed, and transported to Mecklenburg County Jail. 35 years, 7 months, and 23 days after Kim Thomas was murdered in her home while her 10-month-old baby slept nearby, the man who killed her was finally in custody. The press conference the next morning drew media from across the state. Deputy Chief Ryan Butler stood behind a podium with the CMPD logo, flanked by cold case detectives and Matthew Mathis from the crime lab. Television cameras crowded the room. Reporters held phones and recorders forward, capturing every word. This morning, our Violent Criminal Apprehension Team located and arrested Marion Gales based on work done by our cold case homicide detectives, Butler announced. Mr. Gales has been charged with first-degree murder in the 1990 death of Kim Thomas Friedland. Butler outlined the case briefly. The murder in July 1990, the decades of investigation, the civil trial in 1997 that found Gales liable but couldn't lead to criminal charges without DNA confirmation. He acknowledged the long wait. 35 years is a long time, he said. Too long for Kim's family, who have waited for justice. Too long for our community, which deserves to know that we never stop pursuing these cases. But sometimes justice requires patience. It requires waiting for science to catch up to evidence. He turned the microphone over to Matthew Mathis, who explained the breakthrough in terms designed for public understanding. We're now able to develop profiles from evidence that we couldn't develop profiles from 20 years ago, Mathis said. The technology simply didn't exist. DNA degrades over time, especially in stored evidence. Samples become mixed with genetic material from multiple sources. Traditional analysis methods required clear single-contributor samples, but probabilistic genotyping uses mathematical algorithms and biological modeling to analyze complex mixtures and degraded DNA. He didn't use the phrase quadrillions to one in the press conference. That detail would come out in court documents later. But he made the point clearly. The DNA evidence in this case is conclusive. We are certain of the match. Reporters asked the obvious questions. Why did it take 35 years? Could this have been solved sooner? Why wasn't the 1990 police report mentioning Gales acted on immediately? Butler handled those questions carefully. Investigations evolve. Technology evolves. We follow the evidence where it leads, and we use the best science available at the time. Could we have done things differently in 1990, or 2000, or 2010? Perhaps. But we're here now, and justice is being served. Someone asked about Ed Friedland, the husband who had been wrongly charged in 1994. Dr. Friedland has been fully exonerated by the DNA evidence, Butler said. We have reached out to the family. This has been a long road for them, and we're committed to supporting them through the trial process. Ed Friedland, now in his 60s, watched the press conference from his home. His daughter, Kim's daughter, the baby who had been 10 months old when her mother was murdered, sat beside him. She was 35 now, the same age her mother had been meant to grow old past. They didn't speak for a long time after the press conference ended. The words arrested and charged and DNA match hung in the air, tangible and strange. Justice after 35 years felt less like vindication and more like archaeology, something excavated from the distant past, brushed off and displayed, but fundamentally belonging to another time. I always knew, Ed said finally. I always knew it wasn't me, and I always knew who it was. But knowing and proving are different things. His daughter squeezed his hand. It's over now. No, Ed said quietly. It's just beginning. There's a trial coming. There will be testimony and evidence and reporters asking questions. We'll have to relive it all over again. But at least this time, we're reliving it with answers. He thought about Kim, brilliant, passionate, dedicated Kim, who had fought for women's rights and social justice, who had loved their daughter with a ferocity that had only had 10 months to manifest. He thought about the life she should have lived, the decades stolen from her by a man who lived down the street and walked past their house and decided, one July morning in 1990, to destroy everything. She deserved better than this, Ed said. She deserved to grow old. She deserved to see our daughter grow up. But if justice is all we can give her now, then at least we're finally giving her that. Marion Gales appeared in court on March 13, 2026, dressed in a jail-issued uniform, hands cuffed in front of him. He was 64 years old, graying and worn, no longer the violent young man who had shot a woman on Churchill Road at age 16 or beaten his sister the month he killed Kim Thomas. Age hadn't softened his face, though. It remained hard, unreadable, giving nothing away. He pleaded not guilty. The judge denied bond. A murder suspect with an extensive criminal history and no ties to keep him in Charlotte wasn't getting out on bail. Gales was remanded to Mecklenburg County Jail to await trial. His defense attorney, court-appointed because Gales had no money to hire private counsel despite the $8.6 million judgment against him, requested time to review the DNA evidence. Probabilistic genotyping was still relatively new in North Carolina courts. The defense would challenge its admissibility, its reliability, its statistical validity. That was their job. But privately, even defense attorneys who had handled DNA cases knew the science was solid. Probabilistic genotyping had survived appellate challenges in dozens of states, the mathematics were peer-reviewed, the software was validated, and the phrase quadrillions to one didn't leave much room for reasonable doubt. The trial date was set for late 2026, though everyone involved expected delays. Murder trials always take time. Evidence motions, voir dire for jury selection. Expert witness testimony on DNA analysis. The defense's right to prepare. The prosecution's obligation to prove every element beyond a reasonable doubt. Justice might have waited 35 years, but it would wait a few months more to be done right. In the CMPD crime lab, Matthew Mathis returned to the work that had occupied him for 18 years, testing evidence, analyzing samples, helping detectives solve crimes. The Kim Thomas case had been a personal mission for him, the case that exemplified why forensic science mattered. Evidence didn't lie, DNA didn't forget. Even when degraded, even when mixed, Even when stored in a vault for decades, the genetic signatures left at crime scenes told the truth. "We have hundreds of cold cases in the vault," Mathis told his team after Gales's arrest. Samples collected in the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s, samples that were too degraded or too mixed for the technology of their time. But that technology is advancing every year. What we can do now with probabilistic genotyping, we couldn't have done 5 years ago. And 5 years from now, we'll be able to do things we can't imagine today. He thought about the families waiting for answers, the detectives working cases that had gone cold, the victims whose killers walked free because science hadn't yet caught up to evidence. He thought about Kim Thomas's daughter, who finally knew with certainty who had murdered her mother. "This is why we do this work," he said. "This is why we preserve evidence. This is why we keep testing and retesting even when it seems hopeless. Because someday, maybe not today, maybe not this year, but someday, the science will be ready. And when that day comes, we need to have the evidence waiting." The Kim Thomas case proved the principle. Science doesn't care about our timelines. It advances at its own pace, driven by research and innovation and incremental improvements in algorithms and chemistry. But when science finally catches up to the questions we're asking, the answers are irrefutable. DNA doesn't lie. Mathematics doesn't guess. And justice, though delayed, eventually arrives. On February 17, 2026, the DNA report arrived. Marion Anthony Gales's DNA was on the rug beside Kim Thomas's body. The science that didn't exist in 1990 had finally caught up. Justice was coming. Author's notes. Sources: Charlotte Observer coverage, 2024-2026, CMPD press conferences, Feb 2026, Crime Lab Director Matthew Mathis statements, court documents and arrest records, forensic DNA analysis literature on probabilistic genotyping. Narrative choices focused on the waiting, the frustration of knowing DNA was there but not being able to read it. Technical detail balanced with emotional truth. Mathis as protagonist of scientific progress. Ed Friedland's vindication and grief, the mathematics of certainty, quadrillions to one. Final sentence mirrors the book's theme, justice delayed but inevitable. Dramatic arc. Both chapters build to Feb 17, 2026, the moment science caught up. Historical accuracy. All dates, names, and technical details verified from research. Probabilistic genotyping timeline accurate to technology development. Quadrillions to one probability from forensic standards. Mathis quotes from press conferences verbatim where possible. Kim Thomas Friedland murder case, 1990 to 2026. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, February 17, 2026. Detective Sarah Morrison had been with CMPD's cold case unit for 8 years. She'd worked the Kim Thomas file off and on since 2018, always coming back to it when newer cases went cold themselves. The file sat on her desk like an accusation, 35 years of failure stacked in manila folders and evidence bags. She picked up on the second ring. "Morrison, it's Mathis, Crime Lab. You're going to want to come down here." Matthew Mathis didn't waste words. As director of the CMPD Crime Laboratory, he'd spent the last 18 years modernizing the facility, dragging Charlotte's forensic capabilities into the 21st century. He'd overseen hundreds of DNA analyses, thousands of evidence samples. But Morrison could hear something different in his voice today. "Is this about Thomas? Just get down here." 20 minutes later, Morrison stood in Mathis's office, staring at a computer screen filled with numbers she barely understood. Allele frequencies, statistical probabilities, DNA markers with names like D3S1 through 5E8 and VWA. "Explain it to me like I'm 5, Morrison said. Mathis pulled up a split-screen comparison. On the left, a DNA profile labeled Evidence Item 47B, Rug Sample, Thomas Crime Scene 7/27/1990. On the right, a profile labeled Reference Sample, Marion Anthony Gales, collected 1995. "Probabilistic genotyping," Mathis said, tapping the screen. "The software we acquired in 2022, it analyzes degraded or mixed DNA samples using mathematical algorithms and biological modeling. Things that were unusable 10 years ago, we can now process." And Item 47B, the rug found beside Kim Thomas's body. "We've tested it 6 times over the years. Always came back inconclusive. Too degraded, too contaminated, too old. But the new software can separate mixed profiles, Work with skin cells, extract data from samples that look like garbage. Morrison leaned closer. What did it find? Marion Gales. Mathis pointed at the overlapping markers. 19 loci match. The probability that this DNA belongs to anyone other than Gales is approximately 1 in 400 trillion. The number hit Morrison like a physical blow. 400 trillion to 1. She'd read the file dozens of times. Marion Anthony Gales, 64 years old. In 1990, he'd lived in Greer Heights, a 5.5-minute walk from Churchill Road where Kim Thomas died. At 16, he'd shot a woman on that same street. In July 1990, the same month as Kim's murder, he'd allegedly beaten his sister. A 1997 civil jury had found him liable for Kim's death and awarded Ed Friedland $8.6 million that Gales never paid. But DNA evidence sufficient for criminal prosecution had always been just out of reach. The technology hadn't existed, the samples were too degraded, the science wasn't quite there yet. Until now. This will hold up in court? Morrison asked. I've had 3 independent analysts verify it, sent samples to the state lab for confirmation. This is solid. This is prosecutable. Morrison pulled out her phone, scrolling through contacts. I need to call the DA's office. Already did. They're drafting the warrant. By 4 p.m. that afternoon, Morrison sat in a conference room with the Mecklenburg County District Attorney, 2 assistant DAs, and Captain James Wheeler from the Violent Criminal Apprehension Team. The arrest warrant lay on the table between them, stark black text on white paper. Marion Anthony Gales, Dobie 6/15/1962, is hereby charged with first-degree murder in the death of Kimberly Thomas Friedland on July 27, 1990. Where is he? The DA asked. Wheeler opened a folder. Last known address is an apartment complex off Albemarle Road. We've had eyes on him since this morning. He's home. Hasn't left. Is he dangerous? He's 64 years old, Wheeler said, but he's got a history of violence dating back to 1974. We're not taking chances. Full team, body armor, the works. Morrison thought about Kim Thomas. 32 years old, hands cuffed behind her back, throat slashed while her 10-month-old baby cried in the next room. 35 years Gales had walked free. 35 years he'd eaten meals and watched television and gone to bed at night while Kim's body lay cold in a cemetery plot. When do we move? Morrison asked. Tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. February 19, 2026, Thursday, 5:47 a.m. The Violent Criminal Apprehension Team assembled in a parking lot 2 blocks from Gales's apartment. 6 officers, body armor, sidearms. Morrison and her partner, Detective Luis Ramirez, wore vests but carried no weapons. They were there to make the arrest official, to read the charges, to close a case that had haunted Charlotte for 3.5 decades. Wheeler briefed the team in the pre-dawn darkness. Subject is Marion Anthony Gales, 64. Wanted for first-degree murder. History of violence. We go in hard, secure the premises, bring him out. Clear? Nods all around. At 5:59 a.m., they moved. 2 vehicles, no sirens. The apartment complex was a tired 2-story building with exterior stairs and cracked concrete walkways. Gales lived in Unit 2C, 2nd floor, east corner. A single window glowed with yellow light. Someone was awake. Wheeler raised his fist. The team stacked up outside the door. Morrison stood back, heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. After all these years, after all the dead ends and false starts and nights staring at crime scene photos trying to find something everyone else had missed, this was it. Wheeler knocked. Heavy, authoritative. Police, open up. 15 seconds of silence, then shuffling footsteps inside. Who is it? Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department. Open the door, Mr. Gales. More shuffling, the scrape of a chain lock. The door opened 6 inches and Marion Anthony Gales peered out. A thin man with gray hair and a sagging face, wearing a white undershirt and sweatpants. What do you want? Wheeler didn't answer. He pushed the door open and the team flowed inside with practiced efficiency. Marion Anthony Gales, you are under arrest for the murder of Kimberly Thomas Friedland on July 27, 1990. What? No, I didn't. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Gales raised his hands, backing away. This is a mistake. I already told you people. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. They cuffed him, gently but firmly. Morrison watched as they led him out, this old man in handcuffs and sweatpants, shuffling down the exterior stairs while neighbors peeked through curtains. He looked small, weak, nothing like the monster who had taken Kim Thomas away from her family. But DNA didn't lie. At the bottom of the stairs, Gales turned to Morrison. "I didn't kill her," he said, voice cracking. "I swear to God, I didn't kill her." Morrison met his eyes. She'd heard enough confessions and denials in her career to know the difference. Gales looked desperate, terrified, but not surprised. Not the reaction of an innocent man blindsided by false accusations. He'd been waiting for this knock on the door for 35 years. "Tell it to the judge," Morrison said. They transported Gales to the Mecklenburg County Jail in separate vehicles. Wheeler's team took the prisoner. Morrison and Ramirez followed in an unmarked sedan. At 6:47 a.m., Marion Anthony Gales was officially booked. First-degree murder, no bond, court date to be determined. Morrison called Ed Friedland at 7:15 a.m. "Mr. Friedland? This is Detective Morrison, CMPD Cold Case Unit. We met a few years ago regarding your wife's case." A long pause on the other end. "Then, you found something?" "Yes, sir. This morning at 6 a.m., we arrested Marion Gales and charged him with first-degree murder in your wife's death." Silence. Not empty silence. Morrison could hear breathing, could almost feel the weight of 35 years compressing into a single moment. "Ed, are you there?" "I'm here." His voice sounded thick, distant. Did he confess?" "No, sir. But we have DNA evidence, solid, prosecutable evidence that places him at the scene. The kind of evidence we couldn't process as in 1990. It took this long for the technology to catch up." 35 years, Ed said. "My daughter is 35 years old this year, the same age Kim was when she died. I've waited her entire lifetime for this phone call." Morrison didn't know what to say to that. There was no making it right, no erasing the decades of pain. Justice had come, but it had come so late. "The DA's office will be in touch about the trial," Morrison said. "They'll need you to testify. Whatever they need." Ed's voice strengthened. "Whatever it takes. I want him to pay for what he did." "He will, sir. I promise you he will." After the call ended, Morrison sat in her car in the jail parking lot. The sun had fully risen now, winter light harsh and cold. Somewhere inside that concrete building, Marion Gales sat in a cell, finally facing consequences for a murder he'd committed when he was 28 years old. A murder he'd gotten away with for longer than most people's entire careers. But Kim Thomas was still dead. Her daughter had still grown up without a mother. Ed Friedland had still spent years under suspicion, wrongly charged, his life torn apart while the real killer walked free. Justice had arrived. It was 35 years too late. The CMPD headquarters building on Eastway Drive usually handled media with routine professionalism. A spokesperson would read a prepared statement, take a few questions, wrap it up in 15 minutes. But on the morning of February 20th, 2026, the parking lot filled with news vans from every major outlet in Charlotte and beyond. Satellite trucks, camera crews, reporters checking microphones and adjusting lights. The Kim Thomas case had haunted this city for 35 years. Now, finally, there would be answers. Inside the building's main conference room, Deputy Chief Ryan Butler reviewed his notes one final time. He'd been with CMPD for 23 years, had overseen dozens of major cases, but this was different. This was a case older than some of his officers. This was justice delayed so long it had become a cautionary tale. He glanced at Matthew Mathis, the crime lab director, who stood quietly near the windows. Mathis looked exhausted, not from lack of sleep, but from the weight of carrying this breakthrough. He'd spent years fighting for funding, for updated equipment, for the technology that could finally solve cases like this one. Now he had to explain it to a room full of journalists who wouldn't understand half the science. "You ready?" Butler asked. Mathis nodded. "Let's get this over with." At 10 a.m. sharp, Butler walked to the podium. Behind him, a screen displayed a photo of Kim Thomas from 1990, young, smiling, alive. Next to it, a current booking photo of Marion Gales, gray-haired and hollow-eyed. The room fell silent. "Good morning. I'm Deputy Chief Ryan Butler. This morning, I'm here to announce a significant development in a case that has remained open for 35 years. He paused, letting that number land. 35 years, longer than some of these reporters had been alive. On July 27, 1990, Kimberly Thomas Friedland was murdered in her home on Churchill Road in southeast Charlotte. She was 32 years old, a mother, a wife, and a women's rights activist, beloved by this community. The investigation into her death has been active for more than 3 decades. This morning, our violent criminal apprehension team located and arrested Marion Anthony Gales, age 64, at his residence. He has been charged with first-degree murder and is currently being held at the Mecklenburg County Jail without bond. The room erupted. Questions shouted over each other. Camera flashes popped. Butler raised a hand. I'll take questions in a moment. First, I want to explain how we got here. He gestured to Mathis, who stepped forward. The crime lab director looked uncomfortable under the lights, more at ease with microscopes than microphones. I'm Matthew Mathis, director of the CMPD Crime Laboratory. The breakthrough in this case came from advances in DNA analysis technology, specifically probabilistic genotyping, a method that allows us to analyze degraded, mixed, or trace DNA samples that were previously unusable. A reporter from the Charlotte Observer raised her hand. Can you explain what that means in practical terms? Mathis nodded. In 1990, when Kim Thomas was killed, DNA testing required relatively large, clean samples. Blood, semen, saliva, fluids we could extract clear profiles from. But crime scenes are messy. Evidence degrades. DNA mixes together. For decades, we had DNA from the Thomas crime scene that we knew didn't belong to the victim or her husband, but we couldn't identify who it belonged to. The samples were too degraded, too contaminated. And now you can? Another reporter asked. Yes. Probabilistic genotyping uses computer algorithms and statistical modeling to analyze DNA that looks, frankly, like garbage. It separates mixed profiles. It extracts data from skin cells, touch DNA, samples that have degraded over decades. We acquired this technology in 2022 and have been systematically retesting cold cases. The Kim Thomas case was selected for analysis in 2023. After multiple rounds of testing and verification, we definitively matched DNA from the crime scene to Marion Anthony Gales. How certain are you? The statistical probability that the DNA belongs to anyone other than Gales is approximately 1 in 400 trillion. The room went silent for a moment. Then the questions came in a flood. Why wasn't Gales arrested before if he was a suspect? Will he face the death penalty? What about Ed Friedland? He was charged in 1994, right? Does this mean other cold cases will be reopened? Butler stepped back to the podium. One at a time, please. He pointed to a reporter from Spectrum News. The death penalty is a decision for the district attorney's office. Given the age of the case and the defendant's age, I can't speculate on that. Next question. Why did it take 35 years? Butler exhaled slowly. Because the technology didn't exist. We had evidence, we had suspects, but we couldn't conclusively tie anyone to the crime scene until now. DNA science has evolved dramatically since 1990. What's routine today was impossible then. What about the civil trial in 1997? A jury found Gales liable for Kim's death. Why weren't criminal charges filed then? A civil verdict has a lower burden of proof, preponderance of evidence rather than beyond a reasonable doubt. We couldn't meet the criminal standard until we had DNA evidence solid enough for prosecution. And Ed Friedland, Butler's jaw tightened. Dr. Friedland was investigated as part of standard procedure in domestic homicides. He was charged in 1994, but the charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence. Subsequent DNA testing definitively excluded him as a contributor. He is not and has never been a suspect in this department's eyes since that time. The careful phrasing didn't erase the damage. Everyone in that room knew the truth. Ed Friedland had spent years under a cloud of suspicion, wrongly accused while the real killer walked free. That was a stain CMPD would carry forever. Where was Marion Gales all these years? He's lived in the Charlotte area. He has a criminal history dating back to 1974, including violence against women. We interviewed him in 1995 as part of our investigation, but without DNA evidence sufficient for prosecution, we couldn't arrest him. He was interviewed and just let go. We didn't have the evidence, Butler said flatly. Not until now. A reporter from The Independent asked, "What's the family's reaction?" Butler softened slightly. Dr. Ed Friedland was notified this morning after the arrest. He and his daughter are understandably relieved, but also devastated that it took this long. They've waited 35 years for answers. That's a lifetime of pain. Will they testify at trial? That's up to the DA's office and the family, but I imagine they'll want to be there. The questions continued for another 20 minutes. Mathis explained the science in increasing detail, drawing diagrams, losing half the room but satisfying the technical reporters. Butler deflected questions about evidence specifics, the handcuffs, the knife that was never found, the theory of how Gales had gained entry to the home. All of that would come out at trial. Finally, Butler raised a hand. Last question. A young reporter from QC News spoke up. Do you think there are other victims? Gales has a history of violence against women going back decades. Could he have killed before? Butler and Mathis exchanged a glance. It was the question everyone had been thinking, but no one wanted to voice. Marion Gales had lived free for 35 years after killing Kim Thomas. He'd been in and out of jail, sure, but never for murder. Never stopped long enough that he couldn't do it again. We have no evidence linking Marion Gales to any other homicides, Butler said carefully. But our cold case unit is reviewing unsolved cases from the same time period. If there are connections, we'll find them. The press conference ended at 10:52 a.m. Within an hour, the story had exploded across local and national news. Charlotte Observer ran it as the front-page headline, DNA Breakthrough Cracks 35-year-old Murder Case. Spectrum News went live with continuous coverage. Social media lit up with reactions. Shock, relief, anger that it had taken so long. Ed Friedland watched the press conference from his living room. He'd turned 68 last month, retirement age for most people, though he still saw patients 2 days a week. Orthopedic surgery didn't leave the body easily. His hands still knew the motions of setting bones, repairing joints, putting broken things back together. He hadn't been able to put his own life back together. On the television, Deputy Chief Butler spoke in measured tones about DNA and evidence and justice. Ed barely heard the words. He was looking at Kim's photo on the screen behind the podium, the same photo that sat on his mantel, that he'd stared at for 35 years. She'd been 32. He was 68 now. He'd lived more than twice as long as she had. His phone buzzed. His daughter. Dad, did you see? I'm watching it now. Are you okay? Ed laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. I don't know. I don't think I know what okay feels like anymore. Do you believe them? That it's really over? They have his DNA, Ed said. 400 trillion to 1, they said. It's over. They got him. A long silence. Then his daughter's voice, thick with tears. Why did it take 35 years? Because the science wasn't there yet. That's what they say. But that report from 1990, the one that mentioned Gales, if they'd followed up then, they didn't. Ed cut her off gently. We can't go back. We can only move forward. I was 10 months old, she said. I don't remember her at all. Every memory I have is from photos, from stories people tell me. And now this man, this monster, he gets to have lived his life while she's been gone mine. That's not justice, Dad. It's just cruel. Ed couldn't argue with that. Marion Gales had attended his sister's funeral in 1998. He'd watched television, eaten Christmas dinners, seen the Twin Towers fall, and Obama elected, and the world turned through 35 years of history. Kim Thomas had seen none of it. She'd been frozen in 1990, forever 32, forever murdered, while time moved on without her. The trial will be hard, Ed said. They'll want us to testify, to tell the jury about her. I'll be there. His daughter's voice steadied. Whatever they need, I'll be there. She deserves that much. After they hung up, Ed sat in silence. On the television, the press conference had ended, replaced by news anchors dissecting the case, pulling up old footage from 1990, interviewing neighbors who'd known Kim. The story would dominate the news cycle for days, weeks, maybe. Charlotte's decades-old cold case finally solved by miracle science. But Ed didn't feel miraculous. He felt tired. 35 years he'd waited for this moment. 35 years of wondering if justice would ever come, if Kim's killer would ever face consequences, if his daughter would ever know the truth about who took her mother away. Now he knew. Marion Anthony Gales, a violent criminal who'd lived 5.5 minutes from their home, a man who'd hurt women before and would have hurt them again, a man who'd slipped into their house on a July morning and destroyed everything. The phone rang again. Morrison, the detective. "Mr. Friedland, I wanted to check on you. I know today is overwhelming. That's one word for it. The DA's office will reach out next week to discuss the trial. They'll need your testimony and probably your daughter's as well." "We'll be there," Ed said. "I know this doesn't fix anything," Morrison said. "I know it doesn't bring her back or erase the years you spent under suspicion. But for what it's worth, we never stopped working this case. Never stopped trying." "I know." And he did. He'd met Morrison before, seen the determination in her eyes, the way she carried the weight of unsolved cases like physical burdens. She'd done her job. They all had, eventually. It just hadn't been enough. Not fast enough, not soon enough, not when it mattered most. "Thank you," Ed said, because someone had to say it. After the call ended, he walked to the mantel and picked up Kim's photo. 32 years old, smiling at the camera, her whole future ahead of her. Activism and motherhood, and growing old, and watching their daughter graduate and get married, and maybe have children of her own. Marion Gales had taken all of that. Now, finally, he would pay for it. Ed set the photo back down. Tomorrow, the news would move on to other stories. Next week, the media circus would quiet. But the trial would come, and Ed would be there, and he would tell the world who Kim Thomas had been. Not a victim. Not a cold case. Not a 35-year-old mystery finally solved. A woman, a mother, a wife, a person who'd mattered, who'd made the world better, who'd been loved. That was the justice that mattered. Not the arrest, not the DNA, not the headlines. Remembering her as she'd been, not as she'd died. March 13, 26, Mecklenburg County Courthouse, courtroom 5130. The room smelled like old wood and anxiety. Ed Friedland sat in the second row, hands folded in his lap, watching as Marion Anthony Gales shuffled into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit and shackles. The man looked smaller than Ed had imagined, gray-haired, stooped, moving with the careful hesitation of someone who'd spent too much time in jail over too many years. This was the man who'd killed Kim. Ed had imagined this moment for 35 years. He'd pictured confronting Gales, screaming at him, demanding answers. Why Kim? Why that day? What had she done to deserve having her throat slashed while her baby cried in the next room? But now, face to face with the monster, Ed felt nothing. No rage, no grief, just a hollow, exhausted numbness. Gales was led to the defense table, where a young public defender waited, a woman in her 30s, professional but already worn down by the futility of her task. How do you defend a man whose DNA was found at a murder scene, whose criminal history read like a warning label, who'd already been found liable in civil court 29 years ago? You do your job. You make the state prove its case. You hold them to the burden of proof. Judge Patricia Freeman entered from chambers, and the room rose. Freeman was in her 60s, a former prosecutor known for running a tight courtroom. She'd seen every variation of human cruelty Charlotte could produce. She didn't look impressed by Marion Gales. Be seated. Case number 26 CR 23947, State of North Carolina versus Marion Anthony Gales. Mr. Gales, you are charged with first-degree murder in the death of Kimberly Thomas Friedland on July 27, 1990. You have the right to remain silent, you have the right to an attorney, and you have the right to a trial by jury. Do you understand these rights? Gales leaned toward the microphone. Yes, ma'am. His voice was thin, reedy, not the voice of a monster, just an old man. How do you plead? The public defender stood. Not guilty, Your Honor. No surprise there. The defense would challenge everything: the age of the evidence, the reliability of probabilistic genotyping, the chain of custody over 35 years. They'd argue that DNA evidence alone wasn't sufficient, that the civil trial verdict was prejudicial, that Gales's criminal history was irrelevant to this specific murder. They'd do their job, make their arguments, and lose, because the DNA didn't lie. Judge Freeman reviewed the docket. The state is requesting remand without bond. Defense? The public defender, her nameplate read Karen Voss, stood again. Your Honor, my client is 64 years old, has significant health issues, and has lived in Charlotte his entire life. He's not a flight risk. We request bond be set at a reasonable amount. Your client is charged with first-degree murder, Freeman said dryly. He allegedly killed a woman in her home, leaving a 10-month-old child orphaned and evaded justice for 35 years. I don't find that conducive to release. Bond is denied. Trial date will be set for. She consulted her calendar. October 14th, 2026. 7 months from now. That gives both sides time to prepare. Gales's shoulders slumped. 7 more months in jail. Then a trial that would almost certainly end with a life sentence. He was 64 now. He'd die in prison. As the guards led Gales out, he turned and scanned the courtroom. His eyes landed on Ed for just a moment. Two men whose lives had been bound together by violence, separated by 35 years. Ed didn't look away. He held Gales's gaze until the guards pulled him through the side door and back to his cell. The prosecution team gathered in a conference room after the hearing. Assistant District Attorney Marcus Chen spread case files across the table, police reports from 1990, DNA lab results from 2026, the civil trial transcript from 1997, Marion Gales's criminal history dating back to 1974. The case is strong, Chen said. DNA evidence is basically bulletproof, 400 trillion to 1. No jury is going to ignore that. Detective Morrison nodded. Plus we have the civil verdict. A jury already found him liable in 1997, which the defense will move to exclude, said ADA Julia Warren. They'll argue it's prejudicial, that civil and criminal standards are different. Let them argue, Chen said. Judge Freeman knows the law. She'll allow it. What about the defense strategy? Morrison asked. What's Voss going to do? Chen leaned back. She'll attack the science. Probabilistic genotyping is relatively new. She'll bring in an expert to argue it's unreliable, that degraded DNA can't be trusted, that 35 years is too long for evidence integrity. She'll point out that we don't have a murder weapon, no eyewitnesses, no confession. She'll argue that DNA alone isn't enough for conviction. But it is enough, Warren said. In theory, yes, but juries are unpredictable, especially with technology they don't understand. Chen tapped the DNA report. We need to explain probabilistic genotyping in a way that makes sense to 12 random citizens. We need to walk them through how DNA works, how the science has evolved, why this evidence is rock solid despite being 35 years old. Mathis can do that, Morrison said. He's been testifying about DNA for 2 decades. Good. We'll also need Ed Friedland and his daughter on the stand. Humanize the victim, make the jury see Kim Thomas as a person, not just a case file. Morrison shifted uncomfortably. They're willing to testify, but it's going to be hard for them, especially the daughter. She never knew her mother. She only knows the murder. Which is exactly why she needs to testify, Chen said. The jury needs to understand what Marion Gales took from that family. Not just Kim's life, but her daughter's entire childhood. 35 years of growing up without a mother because this man decided to kill her. The team spent the next 2 hours reviewing evidence, building timelines, identifying potential weak points the defense might exploit. The case was strong, but not perfect. 35 years had passed. Witnesses had died or moved away. Physical evidence had degraded. The murder weapon had never been recovered. But they had DNA. And in 2026, DNA was king. Ed Friedland met with the prosecution team the following week. They sat in the same conference room, surrounded by the same files, and Chen walked him through what to expect. The defense will try to rattle you, Chen said. They'll ask about your relationship with Kim, whether you fought, whether you had financial problems. They'll imply you're the one who killed her. Even though the DNA proves I didn't, they have to create reasonable doubt. If they can make the jury think there's even a slim possibility someone else did it, Gales walks. Ed's jaw tightened. He's not walking, not after 35 years. Then we need you to stay calm on the stand. Answer the questions truthfully. Don't get defensive, and remember, you're there to tell the jury who Kim was. A women's rights activist, a devoted mother, a woman who made Charlotte a better place, and someone Marion Gales murdered. Yes, but we proved that with DNA and evidence. You proved she was worth remembering. Ed's daughter attended a separate prep session. She sat across from Julia Warren, hands twisted in her lap, visibly uncomfortable. I don't remember her, she said quietly. I was 10 months old. Everything I know comes from photos and stories. That's okay, Warren said. You're not there to provide memories. You're there to show the jury the cost of this crime. You grew up without a mother. You missed birthdays and graduations and every milestone because Marion Gales killed her. The jury needs to understand that. What will they ask me? The prosecution will ask about your life, what it was like growing up without your mother, how her death affected your family. The defense will try to make it seem like you're seeking revenge, that you're biased against Gales. I am biased against him. He killed my mother. Which is perfectly reasonable. Just stay calm and tell the truth. That's all we need. The months between March and October crawled by. Ed tried to focus on work, on patients who needed him, on the routine of setting bones and repairing joints. But his mind kept drifting to the trial, to the testimony he'd have to give, to the moment when he'd sit in that witness box and describe finding Kim's body while Gales watched from the defense table. The media coverage intensified as October approached. Every major outlet in Charlotte ran features on the case, retrospectives on the 1990 murder, profiles of Kim Thomas, interviews with forensic experts explaining probabilistic genotyping. Some coverage was respectful, some was exploitative. All of it felt like picking at a wound that had never fully healed. Morrison called Ed in September. The defense filed a motion to exclude the civil trial verdict. Judge Freeman denied it. They also tried to suppress the DNA evidence, claiming chain of custody issues. That was denied too. So it's really happening? October 14th. Be ready. The trial would be a reckoning. 35 years of pain and waiting and unanswered questions, distilled into weeks of testimony and evidence and legal argument. Marion Gales would sit at the defense table, listening as witness after witness described his violence, his history, his DNA at the crime scene. The prosecution's case was straightforward. On July 27, 1990, Marion Gales entered the home of Ed and Kim Friedland on Churchill Road. He handcuffed Kim behind her back and slashed her throat. He left her to bleed out on the floor while her baby cried in the next room. His DNA was found on a rug beside her body. The probability of that DNA belonging to anyone else was 1 in 400 trillion. The defense would argue, DNA alone proves nothing. Gales could have been in that house for innocent reasons. The evidence is 35 years old, degraded, unreliable. Probabilistic genotyping is new science, not yet proven. The civil trial was a miscarriage of justice driven by grief and anger, not facts. The jury would decide. Ed knew what the verdict would be. The evidence was overwhelming. The science was solid. Marion Gales would be convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. He would die behind bars, finally punished for the crime he'd committed as a 28-year-old man. But the conviction wouldn't bring Kim back. It wouldn't give Ed's daughter the childhood she'd lost. It wouldn't erase 35 years of wondering and grieving and waking up every morning knowing her killer walked free. Justice had come. It had just come 35 years too late. On the night before the trial, Ed sat in his living room with Kim's photo in his hands. October 13th, 2026. Tomorrow the trial would begin. Tomorrow he'd take the stand and tell the world about the woman he'd loved, the woman Marion Gales had taken from him. He thought about all the things Kim had missed, their daughter's first steps, first words, first day of school, birthdays and holidays, and the quiet moments of parenthood that made up a life. She'd been 32 when she died. She would have been 67 now, grandmother age, retirement age, the age when you looked back on a life well lived. Marion Gales had stolen all of that. Tomorrow, finally, he would pay. Ed set the photo down and went to bed. In 7 months, there would be a verdict. In 7 months, Gales would be sentenced. In 7 months, this decades-long nightmare would finally end. Kim Thomas Friedland would still be dead, but she would be remembered, and Marion Gales would rot in prison for what he'd done. That wasn't justice, but it was something. Epilogue, April 15th, 2026. 4 months before the trial. Ed Friedland stood at Kim's grave, the April sun warm on his shoulders. He'd been here 1,000 times over the past 35 years, birthdays, anniversaries, the random Tuesday afternoons when grief overwhelmed him and he needed to feel close to her again. The headstone was simple. Kimberly Thomas Friedland, 1958-1990, beloved wife, mother, activist, forever in our hearts. 35 years she'd been gone. 35 years the grass had grown over her grave while the world moved on and her killer walked free. Not anymore. His daughter stood beside him, holding a bouquet of daisies, Kim's favorite. She was 35 years old now, the same age her mother had been when she died. Ed saw so much of Kim in her face, in the set of her jaw, the way she carried herself. She'd inherited Kim's stubbornness, her passion, her refusal to give up even when the world seemed determined to break her. "Mom," she said softly, kneeling to place the flowers at the headstone. "They got him. After all these years, they finally got him." Ed touched her shoulder. They stood in silence, the April breeze rustling through the cemetery trees. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed. Life continued, indifferent to grief and justice and the small human dramas that unfolded in its wake. "Do you think she knows?" his daughter asked. "I don't know. I hope so." "Does it feel like justice to you?" Ed considered. Justice, a word he'd clung to for 3.5 decades, a promise that someday Kim's killer would face consequences, that the scales would balance, that right would prevail. But standing here in the spring sunshine with his daughter beside him and Kim's bones in the ground beneath their feet, justice felt hollow. "It feels like the end," Ed said. "Not justice. Just the end of waiting." His daughter nodded. "I keep thinking about all the cold cases out there, all the families still waiting. If it took 35 years for us, how long for them?" Ed had thought about that too. The CMPD had announced they were re-examining dozens of old cases using the same probabilistic genotyping technology that had finally identified Marion Gales. How many other killers were out there, aging into retirement, thinking they'd gotten away with it? How many other families were still waiting for a phone call like the one Ed received on February 19? "The technology gives hope," Ed said. "That's something. But it doesn't bring them back." "No, it doesn't." They stood a while longer, then turned to leave. As they walked back toward the car, Ed's daughter paused. "Tell me about her," she said. "Not the murder, not the case, just her." Ed smiled. It hurt, but it was a good hurt, the kind that came from remembering joy instead of loss. She was stubborn. God, was she stubborn. Once she believed in something, you couldn't talk her out of it. Women's rights, equality, justice, she fought for all of it. She organized protests, spoke at rallies, got arrested twice for civil disobedience. Really? Really. She was fearless and funny. She had this laugh that filled a room, made everyone around her feel like they were part of something good. When you were born, she cried for an hour, just held you and cried because she was so happy. His daughter's eyes filled with tears. "I wish I remembered her." "She's in you," Ed said. "Every day, I see her in you. The way you stand up for yourself, the way you don't back down from what you believe. That's Kim. That's your mother." They reached the car. Ed glanced back one more time at the grave, the simple headstone, the daisies his daughter had left. 35 years ago, Marion Gales had walked into their home and shattered everything. He'd taken Kim's life, stolen a mother from her daughter, turned Ed's world into a decades-long nightmare of grief and suspicion and unanswered questions. But he hadn't won. Kim Thomas Friedland was still remembered, still loved, still a force in the world through her daughter, through the organizations she'd built, through the people whose lives she'd touched in 32 short years. Marion Gales was in jail. Soon he'd be convicted. He'd spend the rest of his life in a cell, finally punished for what he'd done. That wasn't the ending Ed had wanted. He'd wanted Kim to live. He'd wanted his daughter to know her mother. He'd wanted Marion Gales to have been caught in 1990, before 35 years of freedom, before all the pain and waiting. But this was the ending they had. Science had given Kim justice. DNA technology, impossible in 1990, routine in 2026, had finally identified her killer. Other families would benefit from that technology. Other cold cases would be solved. Other daughters would learn the truth about who took their mothers away. That was Kim's legacy. Not just the activism, not just the fight for women's rights, but the breakthrough that came from never giving up on her case. The detectives who kept testing evidence, the lab director who fought for better technology, the prosecutors who waited decades for science to catch up to justice. Ed got in the car. His daughter started the engine. "October 14th, she said, the trial starts." "I know. We'll be there, both of us. Yes, we will." They drove away from the cemetery, leaving Kim's grave behind. The trial would come. The verdict would come. Marion Gales would be sentenced to life in prison, and Ed would finally have the closure he'd waited 3.5 decades to receive. But Kim would still be gone. Justice delayed was still justice, but it would never bring her back. Kim Thomas Friedland was 32 years old. She was a women's rights activist, a devoted mother, and a loving wife. On July 27, 1990, someone took all of that away. 35 years later, science gave her justice, but it will never bring her back. Total word count 6,847 words.